I am your Rusame reader, Kurosong, and today I bring to you the binge compilation for Sticky Notes and Trinkets by RainbowStar_772. That's me! I'm still surprised I get to read my own books. Rest assured that once I eventually get to the finish line of Rival Detectives, I will be reading it here too. Even though romance is secondary to that one. Like, it is very secondary. The main plot is death. Okay? Subplot is romance. But, yeah. Anyway, on to the book. Chapter 1. Rule number 1. Fuck off. Hey, you're the new transfer student, right? A shorter student approached him. They had fluffy blue hair, a little red piece poking out, and white tips. They were cute, but he doubted they had any good intentions speaking with him. Fuck off, he growled, getting away from them. He wasn't in the mood of dealing with someone who wanted him for likely dubious reasons. He wasn't going to play buddy-buddy with someone who just wanted him around for his intimidation factor. I could show you to your class, the other offered, with stutters and pauses. He really doubted the other had good intentions. Fuck off, he repeated, turning and walking off in the direction he suspected his class was in. The small person was following him. Could they really not fuck off? They didn't speak to him, just quietly walked. It made him feel a bit bad for shutting them down. He didn't feel all that bad about it since they already opted to follow him even though he told them to fuck off. Soon enough, he found the room his class was supposed to be in. Room 126. He didn't really care what class he was in, knowing he'd probably be bored to death no matter what it was. He sat in the back of the class, hoping that by now the tiny little shit had gotten the message. He took a short look around, finding the still nameless little shit was sitting in the back row with him. They were going through their stuff, getting out what they probably needed for the class. Now that you got a second look at him, the other had a bit of a baby face. It wasn't helped by how they had dressed. They wore a white sweater with colorful patterns on the sleeves. The patterns looked raised. He didn't remember what it was called to sew in patterns. The other was a fucking mama's boy. He did not have the energy to deal with that shit. They were, however, still too ambiguous gender-wise for him to put a finger on what he should call them. He looked away from them. They were captivating and maybe a little cute, but he didn't want to interact with them. He got out his stuff for class, or at least what he thought he'd need, as he'd yet to get anything from his teachers. His teachers hadn't given him anything, or his dad, when they'd show up for the orientation, for lack of a better term. The other had noticed his lack of materials and was about to say something, but he shut it down before they could even start. Fuck off, he repeated. I don't need anything from you. Fucking leave me alone. The other looked away and went back to doing what he had been before. It felt like he'd kicked a puppy, and now he felt bad about it. But before he'd managed to work up the courage to say anything, he heard someone walk by him and go in the direction of the smaller's desk, pause, then proceed to call the small person a fucking F-slur. If it weren't for the fact that their teacher was in the classroom, he would have decked the asshole. He didn't like the fact that their teacher didn't even seem to give a shit that some random-ass kid had just said a slur. He settled on getting some sort of revenge for that. He didn't know the shorty's name, but they didn't deserve to be treated that way. He wasn't able to work back up the courage to talk to them, but then he saw the pad of sticky notes in his bag. Maybe, just maybe, he could apologize to the person. He needed to figure out their locker, though. He took out the pad of sticky notes and wrote, "I'm sorry," on the top one. Students slowly trickled into the room. Most of them were there by the time the bell rang. Not all of the seats were full, so he assumed there were some missing people. Their teacher started roll call. He wasn't paying too much attention to the names, just listening to them, but not really caring to remember them. Then he saw the shorty raise their hand in response to America. Instead of understanding that they were there, their teacher repeated the name, saying, "I can't mark you as present unless you speak," as well. Needless to say, he was even less pleased with the teacher. But then he heard America speak, and God, he hadn't noticed it before, but his voice was cute. I'm here, sir," the other reluctantly spoke, continuing when the teacher didn't read the next name. As America started to say, "Present," he started recording, deciding to see if he could get the teacher in any other questionable things. He wasn't happy with how he learned the other's name, but now that he had a name to put to the face, he was a bit less upset. His anger wasn't directed at him, but now their teacher, who was clearly a dick. Eventually, he heard his own name called, Russia, and he grumbled out a "present." He felt the teacher's eyes land on him and stick for a while as he said, "I need you to stay after class so I can give you a textbook and a few other things." "And you expect me to get to my next class on time? How?" He snarked, already done with the teacher and knowing that he'd need all 5 minutes of the transfer period to get to his next class. "That's not my problem." "You'll have me for..." Russia paused, looking at the clock on the wall. "An hour and 26 minutes. You could spare a minute to get me whatever you need me to have. Or you can write me a pass. I'm not staying a second after the bell rings without one." "You're out of line, Russia, and I ought to call your mother." "Father," he interrupted with an eye roll. "I have one parent, and that would be my father. And he wouldn't care anyway. He would probably agree with me." "Would you like to test that?" "He's at work, and this isn't an emergency. Feel free, but he'll laugh in your face and hang up," Russia predicted, already knowing that the teacher would test it. "But then you'd be wasting more of your precious time." The following minutes went exactly as he expected. The teacher called his father, got laughed at, told to just hand the shit over, and left the teacher in question quite embarrassed. He didn't stop recording. He was wondering if he could catch the teacher in anything else. Chapter 2. Call-outs and being called on. America just watched, surprised that their teacher wasn't really retaliating. Though, he had to admit, it was a bit cathartic to see the teacher be snapped back at. Mr. Weatherly had been antagonistic towards him for the entire year so far, and he wasn't really certain why. He hadn't done anything, as far as he knew. He'd just done his work and scored high in the class. He didn't say anything, just hoped that the teacher wouldn't take being called out on him. He watched quietly as Russia, the person who had made it fully clear that he did not like him, nor want to interact with him, got the stuff that Mr. Weatherly wanted to hold him after class to get. As per usual, the teacher was making a mountain out of a molehill, as all he needed to do was hand over a packet of paper and the textbook. The packet of paper was presumably a syllabus. The rest of the class went on fairly normally until the teacher started asking questions to make sure that they knew what the topic about was. Instead of leaving America alone, he started picking on him, saying stuff like, You have the highest grades in the class. Can you answer this? Or, how about you, America? When he hadn't raised his hand. His voice was also so very condescending whenever he was addressed. God, America wanted to leave, simply not exist in that room. The worst part was that if he didn't answer, the teacher would put the pressure on him even more, making him feel like a failure if he didn't speak. So he simply forced himself to respond. Every time getting a, "Could you speak up a bit? I couldn't hear you." Even though all he'd done was stutter, he was fully comprehensible otherwise. When the teacher had pulled the stunt on him about 3 times, he heard someone speak up. He hadn't been expecting anyone to, but was even more surprised that it was Russia speaking up. As far as he could tell, Russia hated him. "Are you fucking deaf? The little shit is answering you very clearly. Just move on with the class." America relaxed himself a little. Luckily, the teacher listened to that. He was a bit disappointed Russia didn't use his name, but was thankful the other stepped in. He guessed that it showed how little the other liked him. Maybe he could get the other to view him more positively. Maybe he could make small gifts for the other and such. Maybe he could put them in his locker. He wasn't quite sure the other would take them. He didn't want another person who'd physically harm him. That's what happened with someone he thought was a friend. He'd sent them a blanket and given it to them. Instead of thanking him for the gift, they'd punched him and gone off at him for having such a girly hobby. He didn't really have a reason to think that Russia would be like that, but he didn't want to find out, so that was the safer option. He'd tell Russia it was him when he found out that the other didn't hate him. Or maybe when he could find out that the other didn't mind girly hobbies, like sewing and knitting. There was also the possibility that he'd never tell them. He'd have to give himself a deadline if he ever planned to say anything. But he decided he should play that by ear. If he felt safe to tell him, he'd tell Russia at the end of the year. He grabbed a bracelet he'd been planning on giving to Russia directly, but supposed putting it in his locker would be fine. He'd have to see where that was first. It'd likely be a bit, since the other wouldn't stop by if what he said earlier was true. He could wait. He was patient. He was patient and so very quiet. Possibly too quiet, if his classmates, siblings, teachers, and friends were to be believed. Though he had to politely disagree with all of them, sure that his choice of silence was mainly out of crippling anxiety that made reaching out to another person feel so very, very scary, and so very hard to do. But he preferred to think of it as a preference for the serene and quiet. He could only fool his classmates, family, and everyone else, but never himself. The quiet left too much time to think, to reflect on how much of a screw-up he was. He snapped himself from that thought, slipping a hand up his sleeve and snapping a rubber band against his arm, reprimanding himself for that thought. He was trying to get himself better about not thinking about that. Those thoughts could easily send him into a downward spiral. And he knew those tended to hurt his family, as they were noticeable to them. He shook himself away from those thoughts, hoping this class would come to an end soon. Eventually, the bell rang, and all of his classmates got out of their chairs. Mr. Weatherly was trying to keep everyone from leaving with the logic of, "The bell doesn't dismiss you, I do." America, personally, didn't like the idea of spending more time around the originally black-haired teacher who was going gray. So he opted to get up and silently follow what his classmates were doing. He grabbed his bag and walked out of the room quietly, looking around for a second to spot Russia. He wanted to see if he'd get to find the other's locker, or if he was out of luck. He watched as Russia stopped by a locker, opened it, put the textbook in it, and once Russia had closed it, he got a look at which one it was, so he could go by it later. He looked at the number on it before going off into his next class. He stopped by his own locker, knowing that he'd have some time to do so before the next class. He put the books from his previous class in his locker and took out the ones he needed for his next class, putting them in his bag before starting off to class. Though he felt someone's eyes on him while he retrieved the books. He couldn't tell what the intention of the person looking at him had, but he knew he didn't like being perceived. He didn't like the uncertainty he felt while the person was looking at him. He quickly got out of the area, really wanting to get away from that area. He made it to his next class and slid into his seat quietly, wanting to draw as little attention to himself as possible. He got out his book for the class and the homework, which he'd already done in class the day before. Chapter 3, Rule Number 2, Fuck Facades. Russia felt someone looking at him, but thought nothing of it. He was the new student, and he was taller than most, if not all, of the teachers at the school. After he dropped his book off in his locker, he went to looking for America. He wanted to find the other's locker. Hopefully, he could catch him and watch him get to it before he went to class. Luckily, he spotted America and quietly followed him. He saw America open a locker and exchange one book for another. He watched as America walked off before taking the sticky note and smoothing it onto the locker. Once it was securely on the locker, he made his way to his next class as quickly as he could. He sat down and looked around, a bit surprised to see that America was also in the class. He knew that he was mainly in advanced placement classes. How many classes did he share with the cute person? He was quite curious about how smart they were. He also wondered what kind of activities they might be into. He was brought rudely out of his thoughts by someone calling someone else effeminate. He scanned the room to see who had said it and who was being spoken about. He found someone was leaning over America's desk, and that they were belittling them. He took note of their appearance. He was going to beat that person's ass when he got the chance. America hadn't done anything to deserve that, so the person could deal with his wrath later. They had brown hair, with the tips dyed black, green eyes that would be pretty on someone else, and they wore a leather jacket and ripped jeans. They had heavy black makeup around their eyes. The bottom was accented with red drips to make it look like they were crying blood. He couldn't help but think, okay, Edgelord, when he saw the person. Eventually the bell rang, and their teacher, a slightly chubby lady on the older side, spoke. She had soft blue eyes as she called roll. She walked around the room, seemingly checking on each individual person. He saw how she lingered near America, then saw them giving her something. It looked soft, but he wasn't sure what it was. He wanted to see if he could get a closer look when the older woman came to him. She got over to him and let out a friendly chuckle, checking his name off the list. She made some small talk. She was a lot kinder than the previous teacher. He never got a good look at what America had given the teacher, but he'd seen that it looked homemade. Eventually, roll call was done, and the teacher started class. She was polite enough to tell everyone where they'd left off the day before, helping make sure that Russia didn't feel left out. He appreciated that, but personally found the class a bit boring. He found himself looking over at America. He could guess that the other probably went by he-him pronouns, but right now, they-them was his safest option. So he was going to stick with that until he could confirm what their pronouns were. He didn't want to get himself further onto the cute one's bad side. He kept looking at America. The other seemed quite anxious, though he wasn't sure why. Once he had got his work, he had to look away from America to do it. He didn't like that, but he'd live with it. He quickly read over the work and filled it out, finding it quite easy. Looking at the words on the paper was quite boring. he'd rather go back to looking at America. But he supposed he'd rather look at many things other than the paper, so he doubted it said much. He wrote a small note and crumpled it up, throwing it at America. He noticed how easily America caught the note, then watched as the other unraveled it. How surprised they seemed. He wasn't sure what kind of notes the other was used to getting, but based on the reaction, he was fairly sure he'd be angry if he knew. America didn't throw the note back, seeming to not know where it had come from. Russia decided that he'd collect it once class ended and America left. He wanted to know what pronouns America went by, but couldn't bring himself to look America in the face. He'd fucked up really badly in their first interaction. Hopefully America would be able to forgive him for that. But he knew it would take some time for America to do so. If the other could, that was. If America didn't see it as forgivable, he'd understand. As he wasn't entirely sure he'd forgive someone acting the way he had, with basically no provocation. He sighed a little bit as he got himself back to paying attention to the class and doing the work. It wasn't exactly interesting to him, as he was already well versed enough in the subject to get a passing grade without even paying attention. But he needed to keep his mind off the person that he wanted to get to know better, so trying to pay attention was his only option. Once he was done with the work that was put in front of him, he couldn't stop himself from looking at America again. For some reason, America was so captivating to him. For some ungodly reason, he couldn't keep his eyes off of him. Maybe if he shared more classes with the fluffy-haired cutie, school could be a little bit more tolerable. Well, the main part of the day, he actually looked forward to marching band. But that was neither here nor there. He eventually looked to see how long was left in class. He liked this teacher a bit more than their previous teacher, but it was pretty clear that the versions of the teachers that he met during orientation were likely facades. He'd liked the versions of the teachers that had presented to him during orientation, but he supposed he was glad he'd only have to deal with the teachers for a bit, especially since he had already found himself with a major dislike of one of them. He noticed that he'd zoned out and looked at the time, finding that there were only about 5 minutes left of class, 5 minutes until he could find out a little bit more about America. Chapter 4, Functional Immortality and Caught Changing. America left the surprising little sticky note on the desk that he'd sat at. Someone had wanted to know his preferred pronouns, which was surprising. Even more surprising was that the person didn't just walk up to him and ask. He usually liked to stick around Miss Dackerman's classroom and talk to her after class, as she was one of his nicest, most understanding teachers. But he felt off today, and someone had been staring at him for a good chunk of class. So he politely waved goodbye to Miss Dackerman and got out of the classroom as quickly as he could. He made his way to his locker and found himself surprised when he found another sticky note. This time it said, "I'm sorry." He noticed how the handwriting on it was similar to the one on his desk about his preferred pronouns. He wondered who they were and why they were apologizing to him. He might never find out that information, and he was perfectly fine accepting that, though it would be nice to know. He considered the note. "I'm sorry. Who would have a reason to apologize to him, and why? The people who were unkind to him? They weren't apologetic and doubled down on their dislike of him daily. Maybe it was one of his classmates that watched it and never said anything?" He supposed that was probably it, but he knew he shared at least one class with them, that being AP Biology, because of the note that they'd passed to him. He doubted it was the new person, because they had already seemed biased towards hating and disliking him. Plus, he'd only seen them in his first class, AP World History, He wasn't sure they even shared the second class. He shook it off and started towards the cafeteria, going to lunch. He didn't really eat lunch anymore. He'd slowly stopped eating after how kids had been about him touching food. Being called a fat ass wasn't very fun. And even though he never ate around anyone but his family, they kept mocking him. He wasn't overweight. He was actually far closer to underweight. His condition had him double up on what he ate. He hated having it. Not that anyone but his parents knew he did. Luckily for him, they'd caught it early enough that it wouldn't have stunted his growth. He couldn't sleep. The condition was colloquially called fatal fucking insomnia, though he tended to call it by its scientific name, Nienke Ashka. It wouldn't kill him like it had many others, as his friend China had screwed up a ritual of some kind when they were babies, so he could skip the tranquilizers that were specifically tailored to those fortunate enough to have lived past infancy. Because his friend had basically granted him with functional immortality. The only way to kill him now was beheading him, which was unlikely to occur. He went outside and made his way to the tree kids smoked under after school. It was the only place he could eat without being seen, as he wasn't fond of spurring on the mocking. He would eat with his friends, but he didn't share a lunch period with any of them. He opened his bag and pulled out a small container that he'd packed his lunch into. He also grabbed the thermos of coffee, knowing he'd need the energy from it fairly soon. He took a couple of sips of the coffee and took out some of the food out of the container that he brought with him. He then started to eat the sandwich that he'd brought. He'd made it the night before. It was the simplest sandwich, and it was good enough for him. He finished it quickly, almost flinching when he felt someone's eyes on him. He slowly convinced himself that it was just anxiety and paranoia as he continued eating, taking sips of coffee from the thermos he'd brought with him. He quickly finished eating and packed the empty containers back into his bag, and then continued drinking the coffee. He zipped up his bag and started walking back towards the school. The only thing he held was his thermos. He drank more of the coffee before he entered the school, trying not to pay too much mind to one of the kids who pointed at him and called him fat and ugly. He got out of the lunchroom as quickly as he could, opting to hide himself in one of the bathrooms. He knew at least he wasn't fat. He was cheer captain, and he rocked the girls' cheer uniform. He knew that, if anything, he was too skinny. He sighed quietly to himself and packed the thermos into his bag. He could probably get away with hiding himself in the hall. He left the bathroom and checked to see if there was someone stopping him from heading to the library, as it was usually empty. To his dismay, someone was there to stop him. He reluctantly stepped back towards the cafeteria while the person watched him closely. He looked around for a more secluded spot to sit, preferring to be outside, but knowing more people had probably gone out there. He looked out at one of the glass doors, finding people out by the tree, just as he'd suspected. He sighed a little and made his way around the cafeteria, trying not to draw too much attention to himself. As soon as it was close enough to the end of lunch to leave, he got up and headed to his next class. He bolted towards it, actually, knowing that it was on the other side of campus. It was a gym class, and the teacher wasn't exactly the nicest to those who were even just barely late. America got to the changing room and collected his gym clothes from his locker in the changing room. He was there far before anyone else, so he didn't feel the need to go into one of the bathrooms to change. While he dressed down to his boxers, he heard someone else come into the locker room. He quickly collected his clothes and went over to one of the stalls. He didn't move too quickly, not wanting to draw more attention to himself by doing so. He got into one of the stalls and sat on the toilet seat, pulling his gym shirt on, and then pulling up the black shorts that made the second half of the uniform. Chapter 5. Rule number 3, best friends know best. As soon as the class was over, he watched as America got their stuff together and waved goodbye to the teacher, Miss Deckerman, if he remembered correctly. She seemed nice so far. She'd actually been a lot more nice than she had been during the orientation. He smiled a little as America left. He frowned when he noticed how anxious America seemed while leaving. He frowned a bit, hoping that maybe he could find out what made America so anxious. He got up, going and collecting the little note that he'd thrown to America, and he read how America had responded. He smiled. America had said, "I prefer he/him pronouns, though I do not mind they/them. Just don't use she/her. Thank you for asking." America had also drawn a cute little happy face beside the response. However, it depicted America with a ponytail, which was cute, but America's hair looked short. He wondered if America's hair had been long at some point, and if he preferred it that way, or if America had long hair and was just somehow hiding it. He hoped that maybe America would trust him enough to let him know one day. He sighed and walked to the lunchroom, looking around to see if his friend was there. He didn't see him, but he knew that they had the same lunch period, so he took out his phone and called him. His friend let it ring out, which was fun, to say the least. He sighed and started looking around for Cuba, his friend who he'd known since diapers. Eventually, he spotted him and went over, excitedly greeting his friend. It was nice to be in the same school as him again. He'd honestly missed it. "Hey, Cuba, I tried to call you." "Yeah, sorry, my phone got confiscated." Cuba responded with a shrug. "I'll get it back before I go home." Russia gave a small nod as he followed Cuba around the lunchroom. He wondered who Cuba had been telling him about. Who was the person he kept saying definitely was his type? He'd never gotten a name or a description of their appearance, just a bit of some of their personality that he'd been able to know when he saw them. "So, now that I'm here, are you going to tell me who you think is my type?" he asked, taking a seat and pulling out his food from his bag. "You haven't seen him?" Cuba sounded like he didn't believe him. "Fluffy hair, anxious, constantly in some type of oversized clothing?" Russia considered the people he had seen today. He could think of someone with fluffy hair, but that had been America, and he was wearing a white sweater that didn't look too oversized. The other looked a bit anxious, though. "I don't think so," Russia mumbled. Cuba sighed, seemingly even more disappointed in him, while he gestured for him to look out the window. "Over there, under the tree. That's him. You're telling me you haven't seen him?" Russia was confused for a moment, looking over there, not noticing at first. Then he saw America, and immediately realized that he'd fucked up. He'd already known he'd fucked up. But finding out that it was America Cuba had been telling him tidbits about made him realize that he'd really fucked up. "Cuba, I fucked up," Russia mumbled, looking away from America and back at Cuba. "What the fuck did you do?" Cuba asked, even more annoyed with him than he'd been before. I told him to fuck off," he mumbled, pausing before continuing. "Twice." He winced, being able to feel Cuba's disappointment in him. I think he thinks I'm going to be entirely hostile to him, so I just put the note in his locker," he said, hoping it may lessen the disappointment in him. "Did you sign it?" Cuba asked, seeming a little less disappointed in him. When he shook his head, he heard an audible sigh from Cuba and could feel some of Cuba's disappointment return. He then felt Cuba pat him on the head, patting on top of his ushanka. Try apologizing to him at some point, or just try to be less aggressive to him, Cuba suggested, sighing a little. But at least you apologized. Russia grumbled, burying his face into his arms more. Eventually, he lifted his head and looked out the window again. He saw America get up and start coming towards the building. He watched as America came into the building and felt anger bubbling within him when he heard someone call America an ugly fat ass. Which, if Cuba was to be believed when it came to the fat ass part, wasn't true. Well, mostly. Apparently, the smaller male had a fat ass, but not in the negative and insulting way that it had been said in. America was skinny, apparently. He hadn't seen it. He also wouldn't care if it was true anyway, but Cuba assured him that he would see it soon. What Cuba meant by soon, he had no damned clue, because soon could mean anywhere from the next day to the next 3 months to him. But as for the ugly part, he entirely disagreed. America was cute and beautiful, so he personally wanted to deck that person who said it. Cuba, I know that you haven't told me why before, but are you certain he's someone who I'd find physically attractive? He asked, deciding that he may as well try asking again. You'll see, Cuba said, rolling his eyes. When? He pressed, hoping to finally get a more concrete time. Probably Friday, 'cause game day, Cuba responded with a shrug. Okay then, Russia mumbled, not entirely sure if he should believe his friend. He doubted that game day could really have anything to do with America. The guy was cute, but what did that have to do with how he could see America physically attractive? He finished his lunch and packed the containers back into his bag, deciding to see if he could get a head start on getting to his third period. He knew his gym, which was on the other side of campus. Once he arrived on the other side of campus, he went to the boys' locker room, heading over to the empty locker that would probably be his. He got shorts and a blue t-shirt, which wasn't the official top the school used for gym, but he'd been told at orientation he'd get a proper one today. He heard some movement and looked around, spotting America, without a shirt. The other was covered in blue freckles. He had 2 visible red stripes around his waist. He also had a feminine build. He found himself staring at nothing when his mind caught up with time. Cuba was right. America was his type. With that thought, he changed into the black shorts and blue t-shirt. Chapter 6. Roll Call and Dodgeball. America blushed, hoping that whoever had come in hadn't seen him. He'd rather not have anyone knowing of his freckles. He knew he should have worn the sleeve that covered his chest, but then again, it was gym, and he didn't feel like being hotter than necessary. He sighed a little, getting changed into the gym clothes as quickly as he could. He collected the sleeve that covered his neck and separated it from the one for his chest. He pulled off his sunglasses and pulled it over his head so that it covered his neck and the freckles on it. He'd put the chest one back on after gym. That way he wouldn't have to worry about it before cheer. He stepped out of the stall and put his chest sleeve into his bag, then his bag into his locker. He locked his locker and then looked around to see who was there and getting ready. He saw Russia, Anton, Brian, Eli, and Cuba. He waved at Cuba, as he'd known Cuba as someone who had been kind to him. He then continued out of the locker room, choosing to wait outside so that he wouldn't be late nor seen as more weird. He sighed quietly and went over to the water fountain. He took a few sips of water from the fountain while he waited for some of the other students to come out of the locker room, so he wasn't the first in the gym. After a bit, he saw a couple people exit the locker room, who he subconsciously noted were Cuba and Russia. He followed them to the gymnasium quietly. Once they were there, it was a waiting game until roll call, which would be 5 minutes after the bell rang. The bell was arguably the loudest in the gym, and it always made him flinch. He hoped that the other two in the room hadn't noticed that, though. But if the way Rush's expression changed was anything to go by, he wasn't so lucky. He couldn't quite decipher what Rush's expression meant, though. He shrugged it off as best he could and waited for their coach, Coach Falk, to start calling roll. He waited for what felt like an eternity. He tried to keep himself from focusing on time by thinking about some of his art projects he'd been working on. He was dragged out of his thoughts by Coach Falk calling roll. He also noticed that the usual subjects for being late to roll call were late. He wasn't sure why they continued to be late. He saw most of them get to the locker room in time to be ready and just not get in any trouble, but it wasn't his business. If they wanted to run those laps and get called home, that was their call, he supposed. They showed up a bit after roll call ended, while everyone who was already there was doing warm-ups and as well as the 5 laps that they had to do before they got to the actual activities. America kept to himself, finishing up his stretches as he listened to the kids get scolded. He didn't envy the 2 extra laps they had to do around the gymnasium for each 3 minutes that they were late. They were 9 minutes late, like always. He had no envy for them. America hummed. He'd been called fairly early into roll call, so he already had his laps done. He was just stretching more at this point. Once he was content with the stretches, he made his way over to the area with Matt so that he could get some of his cheer practice in. His shirt was tucked into his pants, so he had nothing to worry about in the realm of revealing his body. He hummed to himself, deciding to start with some rolls, stretches, and a few other things that he had learned. Eventually, he heard the coach call everyone back, so he landed and ran over to rejoin his classmates. Today, they were playing dodgeball, nearly everyone's favorite. The girls were weight training today, according to his friend Japan, though he figured as much. They alternated days on how the facilities were utilized. He personally was not looking forward to the entire lecture that Coach Falk was going to be giving them over weight safety, as he already knew the information. What would it say about him, someone who wanted to be in the medical field, if he didn't? Well, probably not much, now that he thought about it. It was just very useful information, in his personal opinion. He waited as the coach separated them into teams. He was in a team with 6 of his classmates: Eli, Evan, Anthony, Noah, Lucas, and Andrew. He waited for the matches to be determined, and who his team would be playing against. Some of his teammates really disliked him. Noah, Andrew, and Anthony had made their dislike of him very clear with their treatment of him. He knew that they were the type to purposefully get out quickly so that he was left on his own with Eli, Evan, and Lucas. Once the match started, what he had expected happened. Noah, Andrew, and Anthony got themselves out within the first few minutes. He was dodging really well. It was like second nature to him. He and his teammates had managed to get 2 of the opposing team out so far, which wasn't half bad. It was about 4-3, then 2, as Evan failed to dodge a ball. He managed to catch a ball, bringing Evan back into the game, and knock another player off the opposing team. After that, they picked off another one of the members of the opposing team, before one of the opposing team members caught the ball that Eli had thrown, making it an uneven game. It was now 2-3. Then 1-3 as Evan got hit again. So he kept dodging, managing to eliminate another player from the opposing team. The game was quite unfair, he noted mindlessly as he dodged quite a few balls, dodging as he slid to grab another. He managed to knock down the 2 to a 1, which was quite a bit more fair than 3 to 1. He picked up another ball, throwing it and hitting out another member. It was now 1-1. He could do this. When the other person threw a ball at him, he managed to catch it, winning the match. He dropped the ball nervously and crossed to the other side, holding out his hand for a handshake as a show of goodwill. he noticed the other person was Cuba, someone he was pretty sure didn't mind him. Good game, he stuttered nervously as he held out his hand for a handshake. Cuba shook his hand and smiled. He watched the other two teams playing around, zoning out a bit until his team was told to play against another team. It started the same as the previous match, the only difference being how he and the team that bothered to try didn't lose members as quickly, staying there at 3 until it was 3-1. The last person was knocked out by Eli, winning them the match. America opted to shake hands with the other team again, having enjoyed the game despite not really liking dodgeball. They watched as another team played another round before everyone was to run more laps before they went back to the locker room and get changed to go back to their classes. America found himself zoned out as he watched the last match, then ran the laps. He was looking forward to his last class of the day, AP Chemistry. Chapter 7. Rule number 4. Put a bell on the cutie. Russia hummed to himself, walking with Cuba back to the locker room. America was walking in front of them. America was attractive. He averted his gaze from America, not wanting to stare at the other too much, knowing very well that his friend was extremely willing to call him out for staring at America's ass. As soon as they were in the locker room, he watched as America went off into one of the bathroom stalls. The other wasn't comfortable with anyone seeing his body, which was understandable. But he disagreed. America was hot and cute. He should be a bit more confident with himself and in his body. But what did he know? People were assholes, and so America probably had some reasons. He got himself changed and took his bag out of his locker. He waved goodbye to Cuba as he walked out of the locker room and made his way back to the main building, taking out another sticky note and writing down, "You're beautiful," on it, before considering writing his name as well, but ultimately decided against it. He'd already fucked up really bad with America, and America might take it as sarcastic if he did. He hid himself and waited for America to come by his own locker. Then he could see America's reaction. He wanted to see if the note made America feel better. He certainly hoped it would. He watched as America came to his locker, and then gently pull it off and read it. He noticed that America blushed a little and smiled, holding the sticky note against his chest. After a moment, he saw America re-stick the sticky note to his locker and pull out his binder. He then watched as America opened it and stuck the sticky note on the inside of it. Russia smiled a little and looked away from America, deciding to head to his next class. Soon, he reached the classroom of his next class, which was AP Chemistry, if he remembered correctly. As he walked towards the classroom, he found that he was trailing behind America. He doubted that they shared this one, too. How in the world would the two of them share all of their classes? He shook it off and continued toward the classroom. He turned into the classroom, taking a seat in the classroom. He looked over, only to find that damned adorable shorty. He'd be damned. He shared all of his classes with America. That meant America was definitely extremely smart, as all of their classes, aside from gym, were advanced placement, college-level classes. America was cute and smart. God, he wished he hadn't fucked up so badly. He hoped that maybe, eventually, America could forgive him. He wished that a chance could come with that, though he doubted he'd even get one after how bad his first impression had been. He sighed a little as their class started. Their teacher wasn't present. Instead of seeing the tall, older man that he'd met during orientation, he saw a kind-looking older woman of color. She walked around the room with an attendance sheet, seeming to hand out little packets of paper to each student. She got to him, checked him off before continuing. Her voice had been quiet and kind. After she'd left him, he started to fill out the packet of papers, which was a lot of stuff that he thought was really simple. He was a little under halfway through by the time he was snapped out of his thoughts by a fake cough and the woman starting to speak. "Hello, I'm your substitute. My name is Miss Smothers. If you have any questions or need any help, your teacher, Mr. Reinhardt, left me with the answer key to the packets. Come check your work when you're done with it," she said, before taking a seat again. Russia looked over and watched as America started to write. The other seemed to be halfway through with one of the pages. So it was clear he hadn't been the only one with the idea of starting early. He smiled a little before getting back to his own work. He found himself working through it pretty quickly. Once he was done, he did a quick check over his own work to see if he thought he'd done it correctly. Once he was content, he went over to where he had seen the answer sheet be placed and carefully went over his answers, finding that he'd correctly answered as he thought he had. He then went back to his seat, only to find that America was right behind him. Jesus Christ, the cutie was silent. He'd have to put a bell on him if he was always this quiet. He thought it in jest. Honestly, he'd be happy to learn to live with the quiet of America's steps, though he wondered how the other's parents dealt with it, or if they had fostered that habit. He didn't know, nor want to know. He kept an eye on America for a second before making his way back to his seat at the back of the classroom. By the time he got there, he looked over to look at America, who was still checking his answers against the sheet. He wasn't doing so for long, though. He noticed that the other just walked back to his spot, which was apparently a few spots away from him. Once again, he noticed that he couldn't hear America's footsteps, which he found very odd. He hid his phone under his desk, texting to ask Cuba if he'd noticed that America's footsteps were just absent. He then remembered that Cuba's phone had been taken, and he let out a little groan, knowing that he wouldn't get an answer for a while. He looked around, trying to decide how he should distract himself from the rest of the time. He wasn't nearly tired enough to nap. America seemed aware of when people were looking at him, and he couldn't draw for shit. He sighed a little, looking back at the note that America had responded to, and smiled. The little drawing America had done of himself was absolutely adorable. It didn't make him any less confused by the little ponytail America had given himself, but it was still cute. He wouldn't lie. But he didn't understand why America had drawn it on himself. He tucked the note away after admiring the drawing that America had left, and the other's neat handwriting. He tucked the note away carefully. Chapter 8. Watercolor Daydreams and Distracting Thoughts. America hummed quietly, happy that he was done with the work already, though he was bored and not really sure what he could do with the rest of the class time. He thought about it for a bit, eventually pulling out a small sketchbook he'd been using for a while. He started sketching, deciding to draw the people around him. It gave him a chance to practice a bit with drawing faces, and translating people into his art style. He looked around, seeing who he could start with. He looked around, then spotted a girl. He knew her to be named Kelly. She was fairly pretty. She had hazel eyes with golden flecks in them, black hair with gentle waves, had a tan skin tone, and a round face shape. This made her fairly easy to translate into a style. From all he knew, she was kind. He'd never talked to her much, but she'd stopped by his desk once and complimented one of his drawings. He was careful as he sketched her out, using a kneaded eraser to lighten up the lines when he felt ready to move on to adding the watercolor. He quietly pulled the watercolors out of his bag and dropped some water from his water brush into the colors he needed. He started settling in the lightest shades he needed, leaving the area for her eyes white as he carefully painted in her skin and parts of her eyes. He smiled to himself as he started to paint in her hair, by giving it an undercoat of a cool-toned purple, as Kelly's hair seemed to be a cool shade of black, not a neutral or warm one. Then he started to paint in the darker colors. Eventually, he was happy with how the piece looked. He felt like he'd done her justice. Or he had, in his own opinion. Now that he'd finished the piece of her, he noticed that he still had about an hour of class left. He could probably practice with a couple other classmates, or he could try to draw the new kid, Russia, from memory. He knew that the other didn't like him, but he hoped that was something that he might eventually be able to change. He started to sketch Russia, deciding it'd be good practice for him to try and translate Russia into his style, as Russia had a more masculine build and slightly angular face shape. It meant he'd be a bit more of a challenge translating into his style. But he was happy to have a little bit of a challenge. He started sketching, finding quite a bit of challenge in trying to get Russia's face shape correct, which was providing him a frustrating, yet fun, challenge. He opted to draw Russia with a small smile, as he personally thought the other would look a little more attractive with it. He didn't know much about him, but he wanted to learn more. Once he was done with the sketch, he used his kneaded eraser to lighten it. He hummed as he started to add colors to the lightened sketch. He wanted to do Russia justice, even though he'd never show the other the art. He wanted to make sure he did a good job. He always wanted to make sure he did a good job when he drew real people. But for some reason, he felt more determined to do Russia justice than many of the other people he'd drawn. He also wasn't sure why he wanted Russia to be fond of him. Why did he feel some sort of pull towards Russia? He had so many questions about why he felt what he did towards Russia, and that temporarily distracted him from drawing said person. He shook his head to clear his thoughts so that he could get back on focusing on drawing the new person, Russia. They were a pretty person. If he was being entirely honest, he liked their hat. An Ushanka, if he remembered correctly. He couldn't tell if their hair was long or short because of it, so he just kept it as a front view of them. He kept sketching and erasing lines, trying to figure out how to draw Russia's face shape in his style. It took a lot of trial and error before he was happy with it. Once he was happy with the general shape he had for Russia's face, he started to sketch in some details, like his hair, the Ushanka, and a necklace he'd noticed Russia wearing. It was a cross necklace, if he remembered seeing it correctly. So it was likely that Russia was one of the Christian denominations. He wasn't sure which, but he was curious about it. He slightly shook his head to clear the thoughts away so that he could refocus on the sketch of Russia. Once he drew in Russia's eyes and gently rolled over the sketch with the kneaded eraser, he racked his brain for a moment for the color of his eyes. It took him a bit to remember that they were a beautiful and striking amber color. A beautiful color that was often found in tree sap that trapped the insects of the past. He let out a sigh as he dropped some water onto the colors he knew he'd need. He then started painting, letting himself get lost in the comfort that came with the activity. Eventually, he felt happy with the piece he had of Russia, and stopped, moving away from the drying watercolor. While he waited for it to dry, he started to sketch a few people he knew, like his friends and siblings. He'd drawn them several other times before, and he could go over them later with watercolor. He sighed a little as he picked someone to draw. He wasn't sure who he could draw. He could draw Canada, but honestly he didn't feel like he wanted to deal with drawing his fuckboy of a brother at the time. He thought about it before he decided to draw Japan. America let out a comfortable chattering noise before covering his mouth out of embarrassment. He flushed internally, berating himself for making a bird noise during school. He hoped no one had heard the noise. And if someone did, he hoped that they'd think it came from outside the window. He sighed a little and shook his head before he went back to drawing. Chapter 9. Rule number 5. Tuesdays and Thursdays rock. Russia grumbled to himself a little, rustling through his bag for a moment, trying to figure out what he could do to pass the time. He wanted to get out of this hellhole, get on the bus, go home, and then go volunteer. Seeing those kids smile would make this boring hell well worth it. Maybe he'd see that person again. He'd never known their name, but they had a nice voice. They sounded sweet. Their voice was calming. Honestly, the little glimpses he caught of them had been the highlight of his Tuesdays and Thursdays for a year or so now. The more he thought about that, the more he realized it was a bit creepy, if only a little. He didn't even know their name, and yet he reminded himself of their voice when he was having trouble sleeping. Now that he thought about it, if he took away the stuttering and slight tone of anxiety, the person sounded a lot like America. From a distance, he could never really see much of them, so he wasn't really sure. He mentally shook that train of thought off. Now was not the time to be questioning whether or not he was creepy. It was a distraction from the boring class period this was promising to be, but certainly not the kind of distraction he wanted. He sighed a little and continued to look for something else to do. Some sort of distraction. Maybe if he could spot America, he could look over and see what he was doing. Eventually, his eyes settled on America. He saw that the other was holding a mechanical pencil. At first, he thought the other was doing the classwork. Though, upon closer inspection, he could see that America was drawing something. He couldn't see what, though. But he also couldn't bring himself to care about what or who America was drawing, as it didn't really matter. The other was a perfect distraction from the class for him. After a while, he watched America pull a case with a strange gray blob out, and watched as the other rolled it over the sketch that was on the paper, before dabbing at it. It was strange, and he had no clue what the other was doing, but he didn't mind. A distraction was a distraction. Though America was too pretty to just be a distraction, in his opinion. He ought to be the main focus and star, but that was neither here nor there. His eyes remained on America, watching as the other pulled something out of his bag and then continued to do something with it. It looked like he was painting. He never once found himself bored as he watched America do this. Then he started drawing again, to repeat the earlier process. The other started a third time, but only the first step. He suddenly heard America make a slightly content and comfortable-sounding chattering noise. For a second, he thought it had come from a bird outside due to how realistic it sounded. But after he saw America cover his mouth, he knew this wasn't the case. It was odd. It meant that America was an avian, which was confusing, since the other didn't show any signs that often, nor was it something Cuba knew about. And Cuba knew almost everything about anyone. That was his best friend. But he had to acknowledge that the other was an absolute fucking stalker. Not a people watcher, like most thought, but a stalker. His friend apparently didn't know much about that, which meant America was hiding it well from everyone, even when he thought no one was looking. That information now seemed private to him, so he decided not to share it with Cuba. Though he was curious about what kind of bird America was. The chattering noise seemed to be similar to some he'd heard from songbirds before. That bit of information was ultimately infinitely unhelpful, as there were over 4,000 different types of songbirds. If America was even a songbird, because it was also possible America was some other kind of bird he knew nothing about. That brought him into the question of how the hell were America's footsteps absent? It was semi-common among catnecos, but not avians. So, what the actual fuck was up with that? He sighed a bit. He had been keeping an eye on America to see if he could catch any clues about what bird America was. And to also see if he could get a clue on how the fuck America made his footsteps absent. He watched as America went back to drawing, smiling to himself. The other looked cute while he was concentrating. The announcements started, and they were pretty mundane. Like, there was an upcoming game Friday, and bus changes. They lasted too long for his liking. Eventually, the bell rang, bringing the class to an end and announcements to an end. Though it spooked the ever-living shit out of America. The way America fumbled with his stuff was cute, but it didn't make him want to kill the bell any less for distressing him. He got up and packed everything up as a few students straight up bolted out of the room. Russia walked out, choosing to be more calm than his classmates. He continued through the crowded halls, making his way to the bus line. Upon checking, he found that bus 369 wasn't there yet, so he'd probably be waiting for a few minutes. He sighed and took out his phone, looking at it to see if he had any missed text. He found that he didn't have any, which was a little disappointing. He hoped that Cuba would get his phone back soon so that he could find out if the absence of America's footsteps was something his friend had noticed. Soon enough, bus 369 pulled up. He smirked to himself. The number was not lost on him. Not like he was going to make a comment on it, though. After getting on the bus, his phone dinged with a text from Cuba. Definitely a response from his earlier question. The response he received? I hadn't noticed that. Odd for an avian, though. His eye twitched slightly. He knew that America probably wanted to keep that secret, so he hoped that he was the only one Cuba had told about that. I'm pretty sure he wants to keep that a secret. Keep that information to yourself, Cuba. He responded to the text, to which he got an, I will, which he wasn't sure the tone of. That was one of the huge reasons he hated text. Tone did not come through. He sighed to himself, going through his playlist, trying to figure out what he wanted to listen to while he waited. After a bit, he picked a song, opting to listen to Howl by the Family Crest. He found himself humming to the slightly jazzy tune of the song. Eventually, the song came to an end, and the next one played, but by that time, the bus was moving. He allowed himself to get lost in the music before he was snapped out of it by a ruckus from the back of the bus. He took off his headphones and looked to the back of the bus, promptly seeing some random kid get the shit smacked out of them. He could now hear the ruckus more clearly. It was students chanting, "Fight, fight, fight!" towards the back. Russia turned his phone to it and started recording, figuring Cuba would want the information. Eventually the fight got broken up. He assumed their friends didn't want them in any trouble. He stopped recording and sent it to Cuba, before going back to listening to his music. It wasn't long before he was at his front door, which he opened, realized his father wasn't home yet, so went up to his room, put his bag on his bed, and then started his walk from the house to the orphanage, finding himself excited to see the happy little faces on those children, and maybe catch a glimpse of the person who read to them. After he got there, he noticed the person wasn't there. That was usual. They were never really there before 6:45 on the days that he was there. He allowed himself to get lost in playing around with the kids, playing tag with them and other such games. He noticed a couple of the kids departing from hanging out with him and looked around to see them going over to them. He got a closer look at them and realized that the person who read to the kids was America. Oh shit! Well, he had fallen for America more than he had thought. It was worse that he hadn't even known that was America before today. Chapter 10, Sharing Days and Telling Tales. America sighed as he walked back to the locker room, wiping the sweat from his forehead as he let out a breath. He grabbed his clothes and headed into one of the bathroom stalls of the locker room to change out of his cheer uniform. He loved cheer, but he had to admit that it was very tiring. He let out a huff as he tugged down the skirt and pulled off the top. He sat on the toilet seat, allowing himself to catch his breath for a moment. Then he put his sweater on and pulled his pants up. He collected his uniform and tucked it back into his bag before unlocking and leaving the stall. He knew his dad would be at the gates to pick him up soon. So he ran out of the locker room and the building that it was in, making a sharp left to head towards the gates. Once he was at the gates, he took a seat under one of the trees and waited for his dad. Soon his dad was there, and he excitedly ran over to the car and opened the door. He smiled at his dad and let out a happy chirp, immediately falling back onto his avian habits. But since he was around family, it was fine. It was safe. He knew he wouldn't be hurt over it or questioned about it. His father took one hand off the wheel and ruffled his hair gently before he asked about his day. "So, how'd your day go?" America giggled when his hair was ruffled before he thought about how to summarize the day. "Well, the new student wasn't the kindest, but I think he was probably just having a bad day." America started, settling into the car and buckling himself in. "What makes you think that?" his father asked with a raised brow. "Well, I think I recognize him from the orphanage. I see him volunteering there sometimes," America said with a nervous smile. His father nodded and waited for him to continue talking about his day. So he did. "Also, I finally got the little scarf I made to Mrs. Deckman. She liked it. Someone left me an apology note. I'm not sure what they were apologizing or who they are, but I know they're in Miss Dackerman's class with me. Also, my team won the dodgeball game we played today. I also got another note from the same person as earlier. They called me beautiful. Then we had a substitute for chemistry today, so I got to draw a lot after I finished the packet." His dad nodded as he drove them home so that he could get some food in America's system. After a small thing to eat, America was out the door, walking towards the orphanage with a book in hand. It was one a few of the kids had wanted him to read for a while, and who was he to say no? Once he was there, he walked to his normal spot and took a seat, waiting for some of the kids to come over. It wasn't long before there were several kids eagerly waiting for him to start reading the story. He'd be reading from The Strings of Fate by an author of the pen name Niji Moon. He smiled a little to himself and started reading the story. Once upon a time, in a world not too dissimilar from our own, there was a boy named Aster. He could see the strings of fate that connected people to who they were destined to meet. He started, smiling softly as he settled further into the chair. The red strings connected people destined to be lovers, blue to mentors or parental figures, and yellow to those destined to be best friends. However, he couldn't see his own. The kids were now eagerly crowding together to listen to the story that he was telling. So he thought he didn't have any strings of any kind, and spent his time trying to help others connect to their destined people. America smiled softly as he read. That was until he met someone who he didn't see any strings for. So he spent some time with this person who also lacked strings, a deep connection forming between the two of them. The kids eagerly listened, seeing that the story wasn't quite over yet. Eventually, he came across someone else who could also see the strings. She told him he had a string. He didn't believe her, even giggling at the thought. He smiled. He knew where the story was going, but didn't mind. As long as the kids were entertained, he didn't mind. She told him that he had a red string, and then laughed a little. She took his hand to lead him to the friend he'd made, the one who had no strings like him. He didn't believe it at first, but the more he thought about it, the more sense it made. It had started as a friendship, but only that day did he find out that his friend had developed a deep love for him, and he also realized that he'd come to return that. The two of them linked hands with a promise to face what time had to offer together. America smiled. The story was wholesome, and the kids were now quietly excited. He loved seeing those excited little faces. "Mr. America?" One of the kids piped up, a shy smile on their face. "Do you have time for another story?" "Always," he said with a small smile. He happily reached for another story to read. Soon he found one and started reading. He continued to read several stories, eventually having to pack up and head home. He noticed that some of the kids had headed off to bed, so bid goodbye to the remaining children. Once he was out, he saw that it was sunset and sighed. He hated walking home this close to dark. It felt unsafe, and the darkness always allowed him to feel like someone was watching him. He heard someone approaching him and almost jumped high enough to land himself in the tree above him. "It's a nice night for a walk. Would you mind if I joined you?" the person asked. He recognized their voice. He relaxed a little after that. "Do what you want to do," he hummed with a small smile. "That's great, 'cause I'm going to," his friend, Sebastian, chirped. "And what I want to do is get you home safe." "You ruined your own reference," America chuckled out with a smile. "But, all right, I suppose you can do that if you want." "Are you in an English mood, or would you prefer something else?" his friend asked knowingly. "Ni mi sigi cum Anglis. Iligi quod vis," America agreed, letting out a little sigh. That roughly translates to, "I have dealt with too much English. Pick whatever you want." His friend hummed and nodded. "Ruski soy savoy toy koto?" That roughly translates to, "Russian cool with you?" America nodded, letting out a relieved sigh. They walked and talked, ending up in front of America's house, where they bid each other goodbye. By the time he was home, it was pretty dark, so he was glad he'd been walked home by a friend. He greeted his father, who was reading at the table, heading up to his room to collect a few art supplies. He then joined his father at the table and started working on a gift for Russia. He worked on it until the early morning, his dad leaving for bed midway through the night. Chapter 11. Rule number 6. Edgelords eat shit. Russia got up and walked over to his closet. He looked through it, grabbing himself a blue sweater and some gray sweatpants. He wasn't dressing to impress. He didn't really have anyone to impress, since America didn't seem interested in anyone, as far as he could tell. And he didn't want to impress anyone but maybe America, so he didn't really need to give a shit about how he dressed. Once he was dressed, he packed up what he knew he'd need for the day, paused, trying to pick an instrument he wanted to use. He knew he was allowed to change instruments, but he had to stick to one for a week, but then he was allowed to swap instruments. He was limited to only being able to swap once a week so that they could get used to whatever he picked before the game. After a second, he walked over to the wind instruments, deciding he'd play one of them. It took him a while to narrow it down, ending up trying to pick between the serpent and the ocarina. He paused, weighing his two options. He decided on the serpent. It was fun to play, and he'd probably get some good reactions with it. He walked around the room, playing it, practicing to brush up on his skills with it, and make sure he'd be able to play it at a game and while marching. It was a good practice of his. After eating breakfast with his family, he stepped out to catch the bus to school, hoping he'd be able to catch the edgelord early enough to properly teach them a lesson to not fuck with America. One it seemed like he'd need to teach a majority of the school. Before he knew it, he was in the school and tracking down the edgelord he'd heard belittling America. It took him a while to find them, but he'd be sure they knew never to fuck with America again. Soon, he found the motherfucker. They were outside and alone. That'd make this easier. "Listen here, edgelord," he growled, not caring that he'd definitely be scaring them. "I don't care if you think you're so high and mighty, but you're not. You never have been and never will be." He felt eyes on him, and he wasn't sure who, so he'd have to be a little careful about how he acted until they were off of him. "Let's be clear. If you ever say anything else like what you were to America, I will find out, and I will make sure you look like a joke," he growled out, stepping closer to the bastard. He no longer felt anyone looking at him, so he was in the clear to beat the motherfucker's ass. "Don't you dare ever speak to him like that ever again." He punched them square in the eye. If they wanted to cry blood, he'd make them. Well, then he'd be giving them what they wanted. So black eyes would have to suffice. He kneed them in the gut, causing them to fall to the ground, and then he opted to kick them in the face a couple of times for good measure. He kicked them in the side and pulled them up. After that, he spent a couple minutes beating them before dropping them and walking off to wash his hands in the bathroom. He hoped that that would be enough to teach them to not fuck with America. He didn't like having any of the blood from the edgelord on his hands. He didn't like having anything from them on his hands. After his hands were clean, he dried them off and walked to his first class of the day. The teacher was an asshole to America during roll call, which he honestly wished he could do more about, but for the most part, didn't antagonize America during class, which he was highly happy about. The only time the asshole antagonized America was when America raised his hand and then politely asked to go to the bathroom. The teacher commented on his stutter, going just barely short of mocking it, before denying the request, only for America to politely ask again and anxiously a couple more times, before he was eventually allowed to go use the restroom. He sighed a little, absolutely pissed that there wasn't anything he could do for America to make it easier. Though he did tell the asshole to just let America go to the bathroom each time, since it didn't seem like it was something America did often. He sighed a bit before he looked back at his work and started doing it, ignoring the babbling of his asshole and seemingly incompetent teacher. He only partially came back to reality when he heard America coming back into the room. He had the work that had been handed to him mostly finished by the time America re-entered the classroom. He continued to work on the stupid sheets, hoping that he could just get it done and be done with the class for the damn day. The class seemed to drag on for hours. It most certainly did not help that this particular teacher was an absolute douchebag and had a tone akin to nails on a chalkboard. Eventually, the class came to a close, and he was able to head off to his locker and put the book in it. Before he put his book down in it, he saw a small bracelet. The beads were glass blown. The design seemed simple and something probably made by a beginner at glass bead making. He smiled a little, putting the book down before he carefully took the bracelet, putting it on. He was happy he had some anonymous gift giver, especially since they seemed willing to share a craft that they were new to with him. He then headed towards America's locker, writing another "You're beautiful" on a sticky note and putting it on the shorter's locker. After that, he walked to his next class, which breezed by at a breakneck pace when compared to the first. Soon it was lunchtime, and he walked over to be around the corner of America's locker, so he could see America's reaction to the sticky note. America picked it off his locker, read it, and a small smile formed on his face. It was a smile Russia thought was very worth protecting. It was adorable. After that, he decided to head off to the cafeteria to search for Cuba. He looked forward to spending the lunch break with his friend. Chapter 12. Lies and Little Gifts. America watched. It looked like Russia was definitely talking with Damon. His heart sank. Damon was one of the biggest assholes to him. But he could still hope that he may be able to eventually get Russia to like him. But Damon wanted to just ruin his ability to attempt to befriend yet another person. He sighed and looked away, deciding it'd be better to just head off to his first class instead of finding out what sort of lies Damon felt like spewing to Russia. It wouldn't do any good for his mental health, nor would it be good to dwell on it. He took out the bracelet and held it in his hand, turning it over and feeling the slightly warm beads. It was an amateur job, but he hoped they didn't look too bad. Honestly, he should probably stick to the other sorts of gifts when it came to things to give to Russia. Stuff he knew he was more skilled at. Resin, stickers, wind chimes, blankets, knitting. Hell, he wasn't sure, just probably not the glass beads. At least not glass beads until he took a class on how to make them better. He shook his head to clear his thoughts, walking into the class. He sat down as comfortably as he really could there. Eventually, class started, and it went as it normally did. Mr. Weatherly, with his song and dance while pretending to not be able to hear him during roll call. It was discomforting, but he went through as he usually did, just hoping it would be over soon. About halfway through the class, he felt the need to use the bathroom and raised his hand. Once he was called on, he said, "May I please use the restroom?" hoping his teacher wouldn't find some way to be antagonistic about it. "No, you should have gone before class. You can wait." "I didn't need to go before class." He tried to politely interject, just wanting to use the restroom. "Well, you can wait," Mr. Weatherly said with an eye roll. "You let Kimberly go a few minutes ago, and she's back. Just let him go, you dumb bastard." Russia growled, surprising America. Maybe, just maybe, Russia hadn't believed Damon, and maybe Russia didn't hate him. He smiled a little at the thought. Soon, though, Mr. Weatherly agreed and let him go to the restroom. So he left the room and headed to the restroom, using it before on his way back to the classroom. He paused in the hallway, realizing Russia's locker was on the way back to the classroom, and he still had the bracelet in his pocket. It was a small gift, and since no one was out in the halls, it was a guarantee that no one would know he was the person who put it there. He smiled to himself as he walked over the locker, carefully opening it and placing the bracelet inside. He put it on top of the book in the middle of the locker, hoping that would put enough attention on it when Russia opened the locker later. He was grateful that their lockers didn't have locks, and that they weren't allowed to get locks for them either. That was because of some crazy stuff that had happened a couple years back. Several kids had put drugs in their lockers. Some had decided to literally flush their keys down the toilet on the last day of senior year as a prank of sorts, or straight up refused to remove the locks. And a really creative and innovative kid had decided to attach a miniature lock to his that literally exploded if the code was gotten wrong 3 times in a row, and then refused to tell it even after being pried for it. That one had made the news, and the kid even pretended that he forgot the combination at some point. America shook his head and closed the locker carefully, then bolted back to class. He was in front of the door, he opened it and walked in normally. The rest of class went normally. Luckily, Mr. Weatherly left him alone for the most part for the rest of the class. As he left the class, he let out a little relieved sigh, waiting for Russia to leave and following the other to stay a few paces behind him. He hid himself in the crowd so he could see Russia's reaction to the gift. He saw Russia smile softly as the other put the bracelet on. He also watched as Russia grabbed his books and then walked off. He then started towards his own locker, finding another sticky note. It said, "You're beautiful," which flustered him a little bit, but he couldn't bring himself to mind. It felt nice to receive a compliment, and it to read as earnest as well. He took it and gently stuck it to the inside of his binder. He was going to keep those. He could look back at them when things were getting bad and remind himself that at least one person outside of his family liked him. It was a nice reminder he realized he needed. It was a little sad how quickly the next class flew by after roll call, as he really liked his teacher. Soon enough, it was lunch, and he did what he usually did, heading out to eat his lunch under the tree, as he usually would. Once he was done, he headed back inside to see if he'd be lucky enough to head to the library. It was times like now where he could feel eyes on him and occasionally hear insults that didn't help. He smiled to himself. He was lucky enough to be able to sneak by and head to the library. Once he was out, he shook off the insults. They weren't creative, to say the least, but that didn't make them hurt any less. Eventually, lunch was nearing its end, and he put away the book he'd been reading, making his way to the locker room so that he wouldn't be late for PE. He quickly changed once he was in the locker room, doing so in the bathroom stall, which seemed to be the right idea, since he heard someone else coming into the locker room. Once he got changed, he left the stall, spotting Russia with his shirt off. His face flushed red as he saw Russia half-clothed. The other was well-built, and was quite attractive. He only looked for a second or so, following the common courtesy of not staring. He kept his eyes off of Russia and got himself out of the locker room as quickly as he could, not wanting to make himself rude by looking again. Chapter 13. Rule number 7. Cheesy compliments count. Soon, Russia located Cuba and sat at the table with his close friend, letting out a relaxed sigh as he rested his shoulders. "He probably thinks you're friends with him," Cuba hummed in a matter-of-fact manner, pausing to take a bite out of his food. "You know?" "Who thinks I'm friends with who?" Russia asked with a slightly exasperated sigh. "America. He probably thinks you're friends with, or at least listen to, Damon," Cuba responded. "Who the actual fuck is Damon?" "The embodiment of emo boy that you beat up this morning." "The one determined to make himself look like he is crying blood?" he clarified, knowing he only beat up one guy this morning. "Yes," Cuba said, sounding a little exasperated. "Who else would I be talking about?" he asked, the question clearly rhetorical in nature. "He's certainly not the only emo here," Russia replied with a shrug. Cuba rolled his eyes. "I wasn't saying he was, but that wasn't the point. He probably saw you earlier. He's a people watcher. More so with new people here." "Does he do the stalker notes like you?" Russia asked with an eye roll. This conversation felt stupid and redundant. "Plus, even if I do what you're implying I should, he won't believe me." "He doesn't. Nobody's as much of a stalker as me," Cuba responded proudly. He almost had an ooh-woo face. "And he'll believe you. He's good at people reading. He also tends to believe in his intuition." "I already fucked up. I don't think it's a good idea," Russia mumbled. "Fine. Take your time." Russia let out a little sigh, but they moved on to a different topic, spending the rest of lunch with idle chatter. That made the rest of the lunch pass by in a blur. As lunch came to an end, he got up and left for the gym, going into the locker room and getting changed. For a second, while taking off his shirt, he could kind of feel someone looking at him. He hummed to himself and shrugged, not really caring about it. Somewhere in the back of his mind, he hoped that America might look at him and see him as attractive. He also quickly realized that it was almost definitely America, as he looked over to spot the other leaving the locker room. He found himself wishing that the other liked what he saw, even though it was probably just a little glimpse. He quickly pulled the gym uniform on and headed out of the room and to the gymnasium. He noticed that America was in the hall while he made his way to the gym. After roll was called, it was revealed that they were going to be playing fucking kickball. He wanted to die. Jim then proceeded to stretch on for what felt like a goddamned week. When it was finally over, he went back into the locker room and changed as quickly as he could, eager to just get through the rest of the day and to band practice. He paused by America's locker on his way to the last class of the day, smiling to himself a little. He decided to spice it up a little, the note reading, "You are an alluring, magnificent, and nearly perfect angel. Did you lose your wings and halo to walk among us?" It felt a little cheesy, but he couldn't help himself. America deserved more compliments than he seemed to receive. It was a bit flirty, but he hoped it showed America how wanted he was. He had seen enough of how people seemed to treat him to know that, the very least, the other had depression. It's hard to stay positive and find reasons to continue when the only things you hear about yourself are insults. If 33% of a 24-hour day was spent listening to that, then given that 10 hours of that is sleeping, it's closer to 57% of the day. Needless to say, he couldn't help but want to give America a hug, and maybe refuse to let him go for a while. America deserved a lot more love and comfort than he seemed to get, at least during the school day. He sighed as he walked into the last class of the day, looking around to see if they had a substitute or if their teacher, Mr. Reinhardt, was there. He spotted Mr. Reinhardt standing up at the front of the classroom, probably ready to lecture them. Instead of beginning to lecture them, he started with, "First things first, I'm sorry about my absence yesterday. I hope you all got your work done. I'm sorry I wasn't here to give the new little chemist a warm welcome. I hope you all were kind to him." He started, bowing slightly when he apologized. After that, he started to call roll and started the lecture. In the middle of the lecture, Mr. Reinhardt handed out some worksheets for them to do to practice what he was lecturing over. Before he started working on it, he noticed that America was looking down at his lap. It sparked his curiosity a little, so he looked at America's lap to see what he was doing. He saw that the other seemed to be sewing something. What it was, he wasn't sure, but it looked pretty neat. He quickly looked away and then started on the worksheet. It was honestly a bit boring to him. He wasn't but halfway through it when he heard some really fast writing. It drew his attention away from his work, and he looked over to see the source of the sound was America, doing the worksheet he distracted Russia from. He looked to be using his left hand to do it when he'd been drawing with his right the day before. It was odd to him, leaving him with some questions, though he came to the conclusion that America was likely ambidextrous. Russia chuckled a little to himself and quickly got back to doing the work. That was something he found interesting and maybe a bit cute. He quickly got back to work on the worksheet, taking his time to get through the thing. It was boring, but better than listening to the damned lecture. He almost groaned as he finished the worksheet. Now he just heard the teacher droning on and on. He looked over at America and then slowly found himself zoning out. And then, eventually, daydreaming. He found himself daydreaming about America and himself. He couldn't help himself. Chapter 14. Notable Notes and Unrefusable Crafts. America let out a soft sigh as he stretched, hoping to calm his aching muscles after cheer practice. He honestly wanted to flop onto the mat and melt into it, but he knew he had other things to do. He dragged himself to the locker room and quietly changed back into his normal clothes. His phone dinged and he checked it. It was his father texting him, telling him that he was a bit held up in traffic. So he decided to stop by his locker and drop off the books that he wouldn't be needing. It wasn't too long before he was in front of it and looking at a little sticky note. It was a little more flirty than the other ones he had gotten. Reading, "You are an alluring, magnificent, and nearly perfect angel. Did you lose your wings and halo to walk among us?" That caused him to flush bright red as he read it carefully and put it into his binder. He carefully smoothed the note over the inside cover before closing it and sorting everything out of his bag and into his locker. Once he was content, he started the walk to him and his father's usual pickup spot. It was a cheesy thing, but it was a nice departure from what he was used to. He knew he wouldn't be able to wipe the dorky smile from his face for the foreseeable future. Once his dad met up with him at the pickup spot, he happily got himself settled into the front seat. "So, how'd the day go for you?" Britton asked, smiling a little bit. "Other than Russia, I found out his name, probably listening and maybe believing Damon, it went really well. Also, someone is leaving sticky notes on my locker, mostly saying that I'm beautiful. But they got really flirty and cheesy with the one I just grabbed from my locker, so, I don't know how to react to that," America muttered, flushing as he thought about the sticky note that he'd just collected. "I really want to find out who it is so that I can let them down gently. They probably aren't actually my type, and I don't want to lead them on and let them get more hurt. Maybe they aren't interested in you romantically, just giving you a lot of compliments that you aren't getting, and that very well may be part of why they choose to flirt with you," Britton offered gently, smiling softly at his child. "I've never heard you talk about people flirting with you, or heard you say any compliment you got that was even remotely flirty. So maybe they noticed and just wanted to change that. Even though it was quite a stupid way to go about it, if they aren't interested. Don't cast the line if you don't want to catch, and all that." America nodded a bit and sighed. "I guess, but the likelihood is that they're actually interested, and I really need to shut that down so they don't get hurt." "You're quite thoughtful, but I wouldn't worry about it too much," Britton said, smiling softly. "They seem quite aware that you aren't going to be interested and have probably accepted that, especially seeing as their first note was an apology." America let out a sigh but nodded. That made him feel a little bit better. "Still, I'd like to find out who it is to let them know. That way they don't get hurt." Britton nodded understandingly. "You're going to have a hard time catching them, especially since they're waving post-its. They can easily get away." "I know, but I still have to try, at least. If I can find them, I can make sure they get less hurt in the long run. Hell, he may even get a friend out of it." America smiled, daring to feel a little optimistic. Britton smiled a little and patted America's head before they continued on their way home. Soon they were making their way into the house, and America was happily telling his dad about something he was planning to make. It was one of his more elaborate projects. Now that they were home, though, it was nearing time for dinner. After dinner, though, America was off to the orphanage again, though his visit would be shorter than usual, which was admittedly disappointing to him. And probably the kids as well. But at least he could still be their little storyteller. Though his thoughts were cut short when he arrived. "Mr. America! Mr. America!" one of the kids called out with a bright smile. "Look at what I made!" He looked up to find Cassie holding a popsicle star, what some called a God's eye, that she'd made with the colors yellow, orange, and red. "That's amazing. Did you have fun making it?" America asked the brunette with a small smile. "I did, but I want you to have it," she said, giggling, shoving the craft at him and running off so that he could not return it. America stared after her for a second before letting out a small laugh and continued gently holding the gift. She didn't have to give it to him and run off. He would have kept it, even if she had stayed, but he guessed she really wanted him to have it. He smiled a little and settled himself into his usual spot to wait and see what the kids might want to do today. Usually they wanted him to read a story to them, but sometimes they wanted him to do a craft with them. And seeing as a couple of the kids approaching him had some markers, it was going to be an artsy sort of day. He chuckled a little and gently set some of the markers down, going to convincing the kids that maybe it wasn't a good idea to go and color on the walls. He searched around his corner to get them something more productive to color instead, getting out some coloring pages and some blank paper for those who wanted to draw rather than color. America smiled to himself and started to sketch on one of the blank sheets of paper, taking his time to draw since he wanted to draw to the scale of the paper. He enjoyed the artsy days like this. It meant he got to see more of how the kids viewed the world around them, whether through the art itself or the rambling they did while making it. Chapter 15. Rule number 8. Bastards are bastards. Russia stretched a bit as he got out of bed, not feeling too tired. And he yawned. Okay, so he was more tired than he thought. He chuckled a little bit to himself as he pulled himself out of bed. It wasn't like it really mattered whether or not he was tired. He could catch up a bit on rest in class, since he was confident in his knowledge of the material, even though he didn't give two shits about which class was which, as they were all equally boring to him. He grabbed the bracelet from his bedside table and put it on. It was nice. Maybe if he paid close enough attention, he could figure out the person who gave it to him. Though it didn't really matter who it was. He'd like to thank them, but he didn't have to. It was a nice gesture that brightened his day and week tenfold. He couldn't help but wonder who it was, despite the inconsequentiality of the information. He left his room and quickly grabbed something to eat, not feeling like waking up his sister, Ukraine. Even if he did, she'd go back to bed until their dad got home and forced her to wake up. She wouldn't be up late, since it was quite early. He preferred to walk to school, though sometimes it was nice to have a slow morning like he had yesterday. It helped him get in some exercise and relax from some of the dreams he was admittedly prone to. Not that anyone could really judge him. Hormones were high, and most people were physically attractive to him. Though there was someone who had nearly his full attention. They, or well, he, fit what he looked for in a male partner, as far as he could tell, given what he knew about the shorty. Before he even really processed that, the walk was over and he was walking into the school. He quickly walked over to his locker and picked up his book for the first class. He couldn't care less if it was chemistry or world history. Only thing he cared to notice about the class was that the teacher seemed to be one of the biggest douchebags known to man. He didn't even bother to try and remember old McBastard's name, even with the nameplate on the door. Fitz Weatherly. Funny. If his memory served him correctly, his teacher's name called him a bastard. That or Sally was serving him fantasy naming bullshit again. he'd take the name calling him bastard what he was. It was funnier to think that even his parents saw him that way. Or they thought Fitz was a nice name, which he heavily disagreed with them on. But either way, he found the idea of his name calling him a bastard was funny. He walked into the classroom and took a seat, opting to just distract himself from the world until class started. There wasn't really anything outside of waiting to do. He didn't really have any friends there yet, and Cuba didn't show up early. Eventually, a few minutes before the bell rang, he saw America come in and then settle in a spot near him. His assigned seat, his mind easily supplied. He stuck to himself as he watched their classmates slowly trickle in, and about a minute before the bell rang, a couple coming in after that, being late. Not that he really cared. Eventually roll call started, then ended. The bastard yet again started the debate about semantics with America over here versus present. America was already anxious when speaking. God, he hated that bastard for making America so anxious, then refusing to accept the response. He sighed to himself and let himself zone out, only snapping out of it when the bell rang, telling him that it was time to get to his next class. He paused by America's locker after he left the classroom, sticking a sticky note to it. He then quickly went to his own locker. He preferred it if he weren't caught with the sticky notes just yet. He opened his locker and inside found a scarf. It was soft and a gray-blue color. He couldn't tell if it was crochet or knit, but he didn't care. He took it out and put it on, before putting his book for the previous class in. He then pulled the book out for his next class, biology if he remembered correctly. He actually liked his biology teacher. She seemed to be a sweet elderly lady. Hell, she made America less anxious and didn't focus on him too heavily. Her voice reminded him of his grandmother's. He felt a little nostalgic when he was actually tuned in. He shook his head and waited for the class to start, lightly tapping out a beat on the desk before he got an idea. He smiled and hummed to himself, continuing to lightly tap the desk. Soon, class started, and Miss Ackerman started going around to mark people as present. After she'd gotten to everyone, she started to teach. Her style was half lecture and half games to ensure knowledge from what he'd picked up. He glanced over at America and saw him looking down, clearly upset about something. Russia pulled out a piece of paper and wrote, "What happened?" Sad face, before crumpling the note up and subtly throwing it to America. It wasn't what he originally planned on writing, but he hoped that this would help more than what he had originally planned. He watched as America reluctantly unraveled the note before reading it, then presumably began to write a response. He then opted to also do what he originally planned while he waited, taking out a piece of paper and writing, "You're such a pretty boy." After that, he carefully balled it up and threw the note to America. He also watched as America looked at it, then slowly unraveled it, read it, flushed, and then, lastly, tucked the note away. Maybe that would help too. Probably not nearly as much as knowing someone was worried for him. It probably helped in its own way. Maybe it gave America a bit more confidence in himself. And from what he had seen, and some of what he'd heard from Cuba, Lord could America use it. Chapter 16, Hopeful Wishes and Happy Climbers. America sighed to himself, considering how to respond to the note. He then opted to write a quick response, hoping whoever it was wouldn't be too concerned. It wasn't something he wasn't used to. He was used to it. People writing crappy stuff on his desk. He was careful, though. He didn't want to worry Miss Ackerman. He always wiped it away before she could see. It wasn't anything new. The F slur a couple KYS's, and a fat ass. And way too many calling him a whore or slut. Not that he even knew the definition of those. Anytime he asked what it meant, he just got told, look at your brother. Don't be like that. And when he'd asked Canada, his younger brother literally said, I'm not going to corrupt the baby. He was not for the streets, thank you very much. He opted to write, nothing I'm not used to. Just a few insults written on my desk. And left it smoothed out over the desk, taking a guess that the person, the same one leaving him the "You're beautiful" notes, mind you, would probably come and collect it after class. He was distracted from that train of thought when he heard something else hit his desk. It sounded light, not making too much noise, just enough to pull him away from his thoughts. He looked down to see what it was. His stomach sunk when he saw another piece of paper. He reluctantly unraveled the paper, knowing the likelihood of the note being good or nice was extremely low. He started to reluctantly unravel it to read it. He was pleasantly surprised and a bit flustered that the note wasn't derogatory, but rather had a "You're such a pretty boy" written on it. And it was the same handwriting as the sticky notes in the previous note. He carefully tucked the note into his notebook to keep it for later. He smiled a little to himself. That note made his day feel a little bit better. Maybe today would be an okay day. He could hope, dang it. Eventually, the second period was over, and it was time to head to lunch. He paused in the hall when he noticed that Russia, he'd come to learn the name of the handsome fellow he'd wanted to help the other day, was wearing the knitted scarf he'd put in his locker. He internally jumped for joy, snapping a quick, very motion-blurred picture. He had to tell Liz. She'd lose her damn mind over it. He quickly made his way to the library. Once there, pulling out a salad from his bag, thank God for his dad understanding his dietary restrictions, he settled himself in his favorite quiet corner, opened his salad, and turned on his phone. He sent the picture to Liz, who went by the Discord name of I Work for Satan 666, with a caption of keyboard smash. She responded to this with an, well, he accepts. He laughed as he responded in the affirmative. He then continued to eat his salad while he texted Liz. She was one of the few people in his corner, though she was only an online friend. But does he know it's you, though? It's an important question. No. Bird brain. Bird emoji. Hush. Tell him. If he isn't okay with it, he doesn't deserve you. Ooh, ooh. I don't want to risk it, Liz. Risk it for the biscuit. I don't want to risk it for the biscuit. Well, you should. He'll probably catch you. He relies on school transport. No, he won't. I'll just stop putting the gifts in his locker before school. Sad face. Tell him. No. Sad face. He laughed a little, glad he'd brought another gift for Russia with him today. It'd make it easier not to get caught. Even if Liz thought he should tell Russia, he disagreed with her, and he thought it was genuinely a horrible idea. He smiled a little to himself as he continued eating, wondering what if Liz was right? What if Russia was okay with it? He shook his head to clear his mind, and looked at his phone, only to see that it was nearing the time for him to head to class. He texted Liz a quick goodbye before getting up and taking his trash to throw away. He then started towards the gym and locker rooms. Once he was at the locker room, he grabbed his clothes from his locker and went into one of the stalls to change. He didn't like the idea of someone coming in and almost catching him changing again. He took off the chest sleeve and threw on a gym shirt, repeating the process with his shorts. Once he was done, he took his clothes and folded them, putting them in his locker. While he was changing, he'd heard someone coming into the locker room. He'd definitely been right to change in the stall. As he walked out of the locker room, he quickly glanced around, wondering who had come in. He mildly panicked when he saw that 2 people were in the locker room, Cuba and Russia. He quickly left, making sure not to look at either of them for too long. He left the locker room, stopping by the water fountain to have some water before class started. He found himself being the first person in the gymnasium, which wasn't too surprising. He let his mind wander until class started. Upon hearing the footsteps of Coach Falk, America looked up, only to see that some of the other people were there. He shrugged a little. The consequences for them weren't his, so it didn't really matter much to him. Soon enough, class started. They were doing rope climbing, something he was actually really good at. He actually found himself enjoying the class and not paying attention to anything anyone else was saying. He actually fully enjoyed it when he reached the top of the rope. Being so high up, it made his inner bird very happy. Soon enough, class came to an end. So he made his way back to the locker room and changed before heading to his last class of the day. Their teacher, Mr. Reinhardt, was back in front of the classroom. A slideshow had pulled up. He looked excited to teach, as always. America took his seat and waited for the bell, humming a little to himself while he did, glancing over to the window. Before he knew it, the bell rang and Mr. Reinhardt looked around the room to see if everyone was there. He also made sure to call roll before the lecture was to start. "Now, let's get into moles." He paused after saying this, looking a little bashful for a second. "Well, we're talking about titration today, so still technically moles." Chapter 17. Rule number 9. On a scale from 1 to 10, my friend, you're fucked. Russia smiled to himself, excited as he made his way to the orphanage. God, he loved Thursdays. He was calling Cuba while he made his way there. Currently, Cuba was off doing God knows what, but he was on speaker. So his friend was probably at home without easy access to his phone. "So, what's Puerto Rico been doing? Is your brother a bastard as always?" "When is he not? I should have eaten him in the womb." "But you didn't. And now, here we are having to deal with him. At least, he hasn't done any unsavory things to anyone, right?" "Yeah, at least there's that." "Well, I'm almost there. I'm going to have to go here in a second, but before I do..." Cuba hummed, curious of what he had to say to him. "Alexa, play Polka Dot Face by Weird Al." Before his friend could start yelling at him, he hung up and cackled. He hoped that Cuba was near one of the Alexas. If not, his joke was ruined. It was ruined, damn it! He calmed himself down before he entered the orphanage to hang out with the kids. He wasn't sure if they'd want to do anything with him today, but he was happy to go along with whatever they wanted. He smiled as he settled himself in, before the kids decided that they wanted to play tag with him. So he ended up playfully chasing around a bunch of kids, not tagging them, just so that they could enjoy the game, and give them a confidence boost. After a while, he nearly fell on his face as he saw America, the tiny person he loved the voice of, come in. He lost his balance and fell over, falling directly onto his face, after stopping mid-run like a dumbass. God damn it, he was one whipped bastard, and he didn't even have a direct relationship with America. He was beyond saving. America was too cute. He'd never recover. The noise it made when he fell assumedly got America's attention, and he got to watch as a very spooked America slowly approached him. He had this sort of deer in headlights look while he was approaching. America quickly helped him up, And before Russia had the chance to say anything, the cutie was gone. He had bolted. He internally screamed out of frustration. He should have apologized to America. But no, his dumbass just got distracted by his cuteness. He was totally fucked. He laughed nervously, brushing himself off, and then letting the kids know that he wasn't done playing just because of a little fall. They ended up playing tag for a while longer. Read until the kids were tired of running and wanted to play something else. He sat down and waited for the kids to decide what they wanted to do now, not paying any mind to the fact that a few of the younger ones were climbing all over him, and overall treating him like a playground. He was pleasantly surprised when one of them came to the conclusion of wanting to play Jenga. They were playing that until it was time for him to head home. So he bid the little ones goodbye and said goodnight before he started to head home. He was walking, which he didn't feel unsafe doing. He had a pocket knife, and he looked like a grown man. He was not a target. But America, the person who he couldn't help but want to sweep off their feet, was. America looked very young. He had a baby face and was really short. Around 5 foot, if you had to guess. The idea of America walking home alone bothered him to no end. But it was easy to rest the worry with the likelihood that America probably went home with a friend, or was picked up. There was no way that the cutie thought it was a good idea to walk home alone. America was in all advanced classes with him, so surely he knew not to walk, let alone walk alone. He shook his head and continued to walk home. He took out his phone and turned on his headphones, opting to listen to music while he walked. The first song to play was Tli Vazio Yi by EA7. He hummed a little, bobbing his head to the beat. He just continued walking as he listened to the music, humming happily as he got closer to home. Once he was home, he went up into his room and set on distracting himself for a while until he fell asleep. After he woke up, he took a shower, got dressed for the day, and then ate breakfast before starting his walk to school. He opted to listen to music while he did so. When he arrived, he started to settle himself near the door for his first class. While he waited, he overheard a conversation. Look, Greenland, I don't care if you believe me about my brother taking exotic dancing classes. The only way he knows how to get down from a pole is to pole dance. Why would I have told him to not come down? Because you wanted to be mean to your brother? Also, he's baby. You can't convince me that America knows how to pole dance. I don't care if you're his brother. You know what? Fuck you. I'll prove it to you. I'll send it a video. With what time? It's a game date, dumbass. This weekend, bitch! Russia stared at a wall, trying not to imagine what America doing those kinds of dances would look like. He did not need to think about it. He did not need to think about it. He did not need to think about it. Damn it, brain! He vigorously shook his head in an attempt to rid himself of the thought. Once he had managed to rid himself of those thoughts, he was brought back to another detail of the conversation. America had a sibling, one who was in a similar grade to them. That brought the question of who it was. Who was the brother? He didn't know if they were older or younger at this point. He could ask Cuba. This was something that his friend would know all about. Though he might want to wait, because he'd have to wait to make sure that Cuba wouldn't try to get revenge on him for that prank yet. He'd like to know the truth, thank you very much. He shook his head and checked the time before walking over to his class to get his stuff out of his locker. What he was not expecting to see on top of his chemistry book was candles. Specifically, rose-shaped candles. How the ever-living fuck was he meant to transport these? And who was giving him this shit? One was red, another was a peachy coral color, and the last one was almost a black wine-like color. He sighed a little as he got his book and awkwardly fumbled a way to safely carry the candles and the book without damaging the candles. They were ready, damn it! Chapter 18, Concerning Notes and Complimentary Flowers. America sighed as he finally escaped Mr. Weatherly's classroom. He then started towards his locker so he could pick up his textbooks for the next class. He was honestly happy to get out of that class, and excited to see Miss Dackerman. As he walked closer to his locker, he decided to reflect on his choice gift for Russia. He wasn't sure what he'd been thinking when he chose roses. He should have done tulips or orchids, not the most romantic flower known to man. Hell, he'd also gone with colors with meanings that... Goddamn, did he feel stupid. He wished he could travel back in time and shake himself by his shoulders so that he didn't do that. He shook his head and let out a little laugh as he saw the sticky note on his locker. It was cute and a little bit funny. Of course, his secret admirer, as he decided to call them, would write something like that. It said, "If you were a fruit, you would be a pineapple." It was corny, but it still made his day a lot better. He stuck the sticky note to the inside of his binder before opening his locker. He went from happy to upset after seeing what had been placed in his locker. It was a bouquet of spider lilies. He didn't have to check the note to know it was from Yui. He knew she didn't like him for whatever reason, and this was her way of saying that he was better off dead. Her sister, Akio, was a sort of friend of his. She said it was because her sister saw him as competition, whatever that meant. He took the flowers out and looked them over. They were beautiful, but the intentions behind them were not. He threw them away. He wasn't lost to be mourned. He was still alive. He tried to shake away those thoughts before grabbing what he needed and heading to his favorite teacher's class. He settled himself in the desk and waited for the class to start. It made him feel a little better when Miss Dackerman came by for her way of doing roll call. He couldn't help but make a mental note of Russia, who looked a little puzzled. He didn't linger on that for too long before going back to listening to Miss Dackerman while he waited for the work to be handed out. Soon he received the work. A crumpled up note hit him in the face. He reluctantly smoothed it out and started reading it, only to wish he hadn't. "You are going to hell, you..." He stopped reading after that. He wasn't interested in reading another insult or slur at the moment. He crumpled up the note again, tossing it in the trash can behind him before going to start the work, only to be startled when another note hit his desk. He reluctantly unraveled it to read it. The person was worried about him, having written, "Are you okay?" Sad face. He knew their handwriting by now, and was honestly glad to not see yet another shitty note. He wrote down a reply. "I'm alright, nothing I'm not used to," which he hoped wouldn't worry them further. He shook his head and went back to finishing the work packet, pushing it to the corner of his desk once he'd finished it. After it was done, he pulled out his sketchbook and started to draw Akio. He drew Akio with the soft little smile she could usually be seen with. She was one of the nicer students, which wasn't saying much if he was honest. The bar was low enough to be a tripping hazard in hell. His standards for kind were too low for his comfort. He sighed and shook the thought from his head, before glancing curiously at Russia, noticing that Russia was wearing not only the bracelet, but also the knitted scarf. He flushed a little, but smiled, glad that Russia enjoyed the gifts. After the class was over, he got up and stretched before heading to his locker, opening it to put his books in it. He then headed to the library to have his lunch of a small salad. He quickly ate and finished his food before throwing it away in a trash can and picking up a book to read for the rest of the lunch break. He read it, found himself getting a little sucked into the world of the story of the unlikely duo of detectives, though he put it down and made a mental note of where he was when he last checked. He could get a PDF of the book later, but for now, he needed to get to gym. He put the book back and scampered off to the locker room, pulling his cheer uniform out of his bag and heading into a stall of the locker room to change into it. Even though he had the sleeves fully covering him, he felt exposed in it. He left the stall and took his bag, starting towards the gymnasium. People who'd be leaving for games would leave early, so there was a free day on Friday until they left. Then, goodness knows what happens after they were gone. He made himself comfortable while he waited for gym to start. At the moment, he was alone, but that could quickly change. He wished that he'd brought the blanket with him, then considered for a second. Maybe he'd left one in his gym locker. With that thought, he hopped back up and ran back to the locker room. Upon arrival in front of his locker, he opened it to check, finding himself extremely excited to find a soft, fluffy, galaxy-patterned blanket. He took it and ran back to the gymnasium. He settled himself and waited for the others to arrive. The first he saw was Russia, who was shortly followed by Cuba, both of whom seemed to be having a conversation. Soon it started, and as per usual, several people were late. But regardless, Coach Falk started calling roll. Soon enough, the free time started for those who arrived on time, so America went over to the bleachers and made himself comfortable on them. He settled with a blanket wrapped around himself quite tightly. He drew until the announcements that all students in cheer, marching band, and the football team were to get everything together and head to the buses. He got up and kept the blanket wrapped around himself as he started towards the bus, while he made his way to the bus that both marching band and cheer would be on. He went to a spot and settled down, keeping his bag on his lap, even though he would prefer no one to sit beside him. He closed his eyes and waited for the inevitable, only to feel the bus start moving, with no indication of anyone sitting beside him. He opened his eyes and looked around, relaxing when he found that he was still alone. He took out his phone and headphones, opting to turn on some music. The first song to come on was Keep You Safe by the Crane Wives, which he couldn't help but hum along to quietly. He closed his eyes as he listened to the music, allowing the time to melt away. Soon enough, he was putting his headphones and phone away and getting off the bus. As he was getting up, he turned around and noticed that Russia had been sitting in the seat behind him, and was still seemingly listening to music. He waved to catch the others' attention before scampering off to go do some warm-ups and practice with the rest of the cheer team. After warm-ups, they were just waiting for the game to start. After a while, it was time to perform, which he and his team quickly did, happily going through their routine. Once it was over, they made their way out of the way so that the marching band could do their thing. He opted to watch, and then realized how good Russia looked in that uniform, and couldn't help but find him attractive. He had mentally noted that Russia was definitely his type, but this just confirmed it. America startled near the end when someone slapped his ass. He backed away and made himself comfortable as he could in a corner. He and his team would be out there in a bit to do some quick cheer for touchdowns. He slowly left the corner after the marching band was back in the area, as the game was going to start soon. Chapter 19. Rule number 10. Cheerleaders can be guys. Russia couldn't help but stare when he saw America going through the little shortened routines. He couldn't help it. America was hot. Though, he was mildly grumpy when he noticed that America was hiding his freckles. He couldn't help it when he pouted after noticing. The freckles were cute. Half of him wanted to count them like he tried to count the stars in the night sky when he was younger, whilst the other half of him just wanted to poke and touch each one. They just made America cuter, in his personal opinion. Soon enough, it was halftime, meaning he and the rest of the band were out playing while moving. Eventually, they were back being in the unseen area of the sidelines. He just went back to looking at, or, well, not that he wanted to admit it, staring at America. He was dragged back to the normal world by someone tapping him. "He caught your eye, huh? I told you he would." Cuba laughed. "Though you should probably quit staring. You'll freak him out." "He's hot, and I probably am not the only one. Not that I like that particular thought." Cuba rolled his eyes, but let Russia be. Though before he walked off, he decided to impart a piece of advice on Russia. America recognized his handwriting, by the way. Heard Reinhardt was planning a group project, so don't get caught dead writing anything. Digitalize your notes or something. "Oh, hell, I already have digital notes. I can't even read my own handwriting." Russia groaned, dragging a hand down his face. "English sucks. So does my English handwriting." Cuba rolled his eyes, but left Russia alone after that. Despite the words of warning, Russia went back to watching. Not staring at, fuck you, America, who was waiting for the next point to be scored. The uniform hugged America's form really well. The top was a neutral purple with white accents, and the skirt, which he believed to be a skirt, was white with a purple, the same purple as the top, stripe near the bottom of it. Right now, he could actually see that America had long hair, and could understand why America drew himself the way he did. It was in a ponytail, and there was a themed bow in it. It looked thick and fluffy, and he kind of wanted to mess with it and maybe bury his face in it. Soon enough, he was once again entranced by America doing a miniature cheer routine for another scored point. Usually, he didn't care if their team lost or won, but he would prefer if they won so he could see America perform like that more often. He was easily distracted until the game was over. And when it was time for them to play, as well as one last large cheer from the cheer team, he allowed himself to fall comfortably into the routine, playing the serpent. He didn't want to stare at America, just focused on what he was supposed to be doing. Soon enough, it was over, and they were getting back onto the bus. He opted to sit behind America, as he had on the ride there. He allowed himself to get lost in thought, only to be dragged back to reality by someone playing the Pornhub intro soundbite, which was promptly imitated by a trombone. He regretted befriending the band. Why had he allowed himself to become friends with them 3 years ago? He didn't know, but he regretted his choices immensely at the moment. He grabbed his headphones from his bag and put them on, not wanting to deal with this shit right now. He scrolled through his playlist and picked a song to listen to. He tapped Rule 34 by Fish in a Birdcage. He ended up humming to it as he listened to it. He also closed his eyes to allow himself to forget about his surroundings. After a while, he opened his eyes and watched out the window, realizing they were getting closer to his house. They were at their first stop. He watched a girl he didn't know the name of get off the bus. She was covering up a lot for someone who was a cheerleader. She also had a cross necklace. He subtly peered over and noticed that America was wrapped in a pretty blanket, and his hair looked short again. He didn't like either fact that much, but the blanket was forgivable, but how short the hair was made to look was not. He sunk back into his seat and went back to listening to music, though he was grumpy this time. Eventually, he was getting off the bus and heading into his home. He went to his room and carefully put away his instrument before collecting some comfortable sleeping clothes and getting out of his uniform. He'd seen America get into his cheer uniform during gym, so he might take a page out of the cutie's book and change during gym. It was a good idea, and it would probably be a lot more comfortable than changing in a most likely unfamiliar place. Once he was comfortable in his pajamas, he folded his uniform before getting comfortable in his bed. He allowed himself to fall into a deep sleep. He yawned and stretched as he got up, attempting to rub the sleep from his eyes. He headed to the bathroom to take a shower. Once he was clean, he hopped out of the shower and got dressed for the day, before heading to the kitchen to make himself a cup of coffee. Dobre jutro, tata, he mumbled, taking a sip of coffee. That roughly translates to, "Good morning, Dad." Dobre jutro, Lucia, his papa responded. How was the first week? Again, the Russian roughly translates to, "Good morning, Russia." Good other than a couple of stupid-ass people. Sure, Captain Scoot, he tiredly said, and took another few sips of the coffee. She interests you, I take it? His father asked in a teasing tone that flew over one very tired Russia's head. Russia tiredly and absent-mindedly corrected. And yeah, he brightens pretty much any room he steps foot in. He has low self-esteem, though, and the people are assholes. Soviet laughed a little at that, opting to listen to his son ramble for a while. Over the next week, Russia received more gifts. One every fucking day. On Monday, he found a handmade bunny plush. On Tuesday, he found a bear sticker with some pressed flowers that he recognized as orchids. He found a bracelet with the colors of the bisexual flag. On Wednesday, whoever was giving him these things was paying attention to him, as it was in the order of the bisexual flag. He had a small pin on his Oshanka as a subtle nod to his sexuality. Thursday, he found a very small flower-patterned quilt. That was currently on his bed. It was getting ridiculous at this point. He was currently on the bus to school. He had no doubts he'd find another gift in his locker today. Ukraine, do you think I could convince Papa to let me have an Uber home? I need to find whoever is leaving stuff in my locker. No shot. If you do, it'll take a few days. And who knows, they might stop. In response to that, Russia shoved his head into his hands and groaned. Chapter 20. Chats of Crushes and Flirtatious Notes. America hummed, looking around to see if Russia was around before slipping the charmed necklace into the locker. The charm was one he was quite proud of. He'd made it himself. It had two purple hands reaching out towards one another, coming just short in a heart. It was on a black background with little splotches that looked like stars. It was attached to a gold backing that allowed it to be a necklace. He'd engraved the Japanese symbol of luck onto the back of it. That was something his friend Japan had suggested. She wanted him to do that with any charms he made, which he'd been doing since she had shown him the symbol. Once the necklace was placed in the locker, he closed the locker and walked away from it quickly. While he decided where he was going, his thoughts drifted to the person he was giving gifts. He'd noticed that Russia wasn't rude to him. Russia, if anything, was indifferent to him, which wasn't the best, but it was certainly better than Russia being rude to him, or worse, hating him. He had also noticed that Russia seemed to like the gift so far, though there was some frustration that he'd been showing as of a couple days ago. He wasn't sure about why. He'd also kept getting notes from the person he shared biology with. They were actually kind, but very flirty. He really needed to catch them before he accidentally broke their heart. Their attempts were cute, but he was very gay, and they probably weren't his type. He shook his head, ending up settling himself down in the library. He couldn't help but find Russia pretty, as well as attractive. Russia fit his type to a T for the most part. And if he was correct about the pin he'd noticed, Russia was bisexual, and he might have a chance, given Russia didn't hate him. He honestly hoped that he might fit Russia's type. Something in his instincts stirred at the thought. It was a new thing to him, but he was able to place it pretty quickly. He was an avian, so it was probably tied to the craving for a monogamous relationship. The until death do us part type. He couldn't shake the feeling that he might have a crush on Russia, so he ended up texting Liz. Liz, what's up? I might be screwed. I think I may have a crush. Do tell. Do tell. Oh, well. So, you know Russia? I think I have a crush on him. I kinda just wanna cuddle him, listen to him talk, be held by him. I also really like what bits of his personality that I've seen. Also, he volunteers at the same orphanage as I do, the Little Star Circle. He's really nice, and he plays with the kids. He also seems really playful when he's with his friends. You're in love. You're falling hard, hobo. I bet you'd be dreaming about him if you could sleep. I don't want to prove you right, but I can daydream, and I may have daydreamed a little bit about him. After sending that message, he put his phone down and grabbed a book, deciding he didn't want to deal with that can of worms at the moment. He wasn't lying when he said that he might have had a couple daydreams about Russia, because it wasn't a might have had. It was he had had a couple. He couldn't help it. He wanted to be close to Russia. He just kept reading for a while before deciding to see if Russia was at school yet. He preferred being able to see Russia's reactions to the gifts, to know whether or not they were enjoyed. He saw Russia coming with the bus riders, talking with a girl who was a bit shorter. They looked related. He'd seen them talking before and heard a conversation of theirs, so he knew they were siblings. He found a place that he could be hidden in, using the halls that were getting a little crowded to do so. He watched as Russia opened the locker and picked up the necklace. He was smiling, but something was clearly annoying Russia. He frowned a little when he noticed that, but his mood was quickly lightened when he saw Russia put the necklace on. He smiled a little as he went back to his own locker to get his books and work from it. He noticed that Russia was wearing both bracelets he'd made him, which was more than elating to him. Knowing that Russia enjoyed the gifts to that far of an extent, it was nice. All he could really do was hope that Russia finding out who he was wouldn't ruin the gifts for him. He shook his head and started towards world history, admittedly craving his own death during roll call. Mr. Weatherly just couldn't seem to accept that he was there and that he was coherent when he spoke. He zoned out after a little while, his thoughts drifting to Russia again. But Russia didn't seem okay with letting Mr. Weatherly be rude to him like that. That brought him to something else he liked about Russia. His ability to speak his mind and unwillingness to go unheard. It was nice to have someone like that stand up for him, even if otherwise they were ignorant to his existence. If he were entirely honest, he'd just like to be held by Russia. He had the feeling that he'd feel extremely safe and quite comfortable in his arms. And when Russia was just speaking, not snarking at someone, America loved listening to his voice. It was deep and had an accent to it that he quite liked. He didn't get to hear it himself very often, because most of the time that he heard Russia's voice was when he was being snarky to Mr. Weatherly, which may not make his voice comforting, but again, it was nice to hear someone stand up for him. America, what are the origins of the Rus? America was dragged out of his thoughts by the grating voice of Mr. Weatherly. That wasn't even in their textbook, and they sure as heck hadn't covered it. He took a deep breath to collect himself. They were originally, they were a mix of Swedish and Eastern Slavs. The Swedish having set themselves up as a ruling class, but time did what it tends to, and assimilation occurred gradually. America explained quietly. He hated the attention that had been placed on him the moment that he was called on. Before the asshole could continue to be an asshole to him, Russia spoke up, saying, "It's not even in our course material. Leave America the fuck alone, asshole." Russia paused for a moment before looking over in his direction. "Also, not half bad. You are right on the money, I believe the phrase is." America smiled a little at that, a little blush dusting his cheeks at the compliment. He still wasn't used to compliments, even with the sticky notes and the compliments that they contained. He shook his head in a futile attempt to get rid of the blush on his cheeks. He eventually opted to reach into his bag and read a book his sister had recommended to him. So far, he'd been liking it. The book allowed him to escape the reality of a class that bored him half to death. It didn't feel like long before he was pulled out of the fictional world of the detectives he was reading about, as the bell rang and it was time to head to Miss Deckerman's class, which he knew would go by quickly. Before heading to the classroom, he stopped by his locker to drop off the world history book. He flushed red as he read another sticky note that had been left on his locker. He took the note, which said, "You look absolutely angelic today," with a heart, and stuck it to his binder to file away in his room with the plenty other sticky notes that he had from this person. Before leaving his locker, he grabbed his biology book and put away the world history book. He then closed his locker and headed into the next class, a bit surprised to see a note on his desk. In the same handwriting as before, it said, "Hey, don't listen to those assholes. You are beautiful, and there are many reasons to live in this world." He smiled a little, and carefully stuck the note into his binder, looking around to see if he could get any hints as to who it was. To his disappointment, there were too many people already there to tell, as Miss Deckerman actually knew how to be nice and make people want to show up. Miss Deckerman came over and smiled at him. She lightly ruffled his hair. "A kind young man cleaned your desk. Told me you'd know him when you see him. Do tell him thank you," she said in her usual kind tone. She was definitely a grandmother figure to him. I don't know who. Could you tell me?" "Well, dearie, if you don't know, they probably don't want you to. I won't meddle in it," she said softly, smiling at him. "Regardless, good morning, sweetheart." Soon enough, the bell had rung and class was starting. Miss Deckerman did her roll call, and after that, America barely noticed when he zoned out, his thoughts fading into daydreams about Russia. Chapter 21, Rule number 11, Books can be deceiving. Russia looked over to the bleachers where he had seen America go, scanning them to spot several people just chilling out and talking on them. It had taken him a bit to find America, who had opted to hide in a far corner of the bleachers, and was covered mostly by a blanket. He knew America was in a cheer uniform under the blanket. He'd seen it during roll call. He'd say he wasn't complaining, but he was upset, because he liked seeing America in that outfit, and, well, in general. He had to admit, though, America was hotter in the outfit. If he had glasses, they would have steamed up enough to warrant anti-fog on them at this point. Glasses were interesting when it came to America, though. He'd seen America knock his sunglasses off once. Instead of just continuing on like a regular person, America winced and closed his eyes as much as he could. America had really pretty purple eyes with black sclera. He'd cemented those eyes into his mind. They were very pretty. He'd asked Cuba about the wincing and had gotten a small shrug in a response of, "From what I've been able to get, his eyes are really light sensitive. The sunglasses are a prescription. Don't know anything about the particular condition, because he's the person I have the least on. Sneaky little gremlin." Out of curiosity and concern about America, he'd looked into it. The only thing he could really find was photophobia, and a one-off study that connected a fatal sleeping disorder to mutations with the senses. He doubted it was the sleep disorder, though, as most found to have it were dead before they were even a month old. At least he had a better grasp of what he might be able to do to help out America, if he could work up the guts to talk to him. Or he could be entirely wrong about the photophobia, and it was just the fact that America didn't have a white sclera, but black, which he had no problems with, mind you. Looking into them was like looking into the night sky. They were fucking pretty. Sue him. He knew he'd be able to see America's eyes if the lights were heavily dimmed. Maybe America could handle sunlight, though he probably couldn't. So closed curtains and heavily dimmed lights if he wanted to see those pretty eyes. He found himself extremely thankful for the lights in his room being controllable in brightness and color. It'd mean that he'd actually be able to see America's pretty eyes again. He shook his head a couple of times before going to find Cuba, figuring his friend would have some stuff they could do while they waited. Apparently, the best idea Cuba had for while they waited was practice, which was fine by him. He'd opted to use the nickel harpa this week, as he'd enjoyed his ability to baffle people with random instruments. They ended up practicing until they were called to go, which happened when they were midway through. Rush aside and stretched, following Cuba to the bus, finding himself gazing ahead of them at America, who looked pretty despite the blanket wrapped around him. "You are so down bad," he heard Cuba whisper from beside him. "Shut the fuck up," he whispered back, hoping America hadn't heard either of them. The only response he got to that was a chuckle. He opted to lightly smack Cuba on the back of the head for that. He then decided to speed up a little and ignore Cuba while he got on the bus. He opted to sit behind America, as he had last Friday, which he noticed seemed to have a positive effect on the cutie. He was entirely happy to do it again, as it didn't really do anything to him. It was a net positive, so he was happy to do it again. He looked out the window as he waited for the bus to start moving. He also opted to listen to some music. He was pulled out of the music by a text from Cuba. All it said was, "Guess what?" And there was a video attachment, which he stared at for a long moment to process it. He reluctantly opened the attachment and heavily flushed when he realized what it was. It was a fucking video of America, the innocent-looking, painfully anxious and shy avian, coming down from the top of a fucking pole. He was moving in a way that only lent itself to strippers. Then the voice of someone he vaguely recognized from a while back, someone he knew as America's brother, asked in a light and playful tone, "Know any other ways to get down, lil' bro?" The response came from in an almost pitifully quiet tone. "No, Canada, you know, this. The only other way down is to jump. Also, I'm older than you. Still little, was the last response before the video cut. Russia stared at his now blank screen for a long while, internally screaming. He was sure he was more lit up than a Christmas tree. His face was certainly redder than a tomato. He stared at his phone a little longer before deciding he did not need to think about this right now. He closed his text with Cuba and sent a text to his dad, hoping he might be able to convince him to attempt to catch his little gift giver. He could tell there was probably some sort of romantic interest behind it, and he really didn't feel like being that guy. The one who broke some poor motherfucker's heart. It'd be best to just let them know he wasn't interested in that way, but they could become friends. After sending that text, he opted to go back to listening to music, ending up humming along to it. He was snapped out of it by his phone vibrating with a response, which he promptly checked. Fine, you can Thursday. Only if they're still doing it then, was the response that he'd gotten from his dad. That prompted a mini internal celebration. He was very happy with that. It meant he'd caused someone less pain, and they'd stop being a constant question of, "Who the fuck are you?" to him. After a moment, he stared at the seat in front of him, wondering what America was doing. He'd probably never know, nor be close enough to America to be allowed to exist near him without causing anxiety in the little cutie. He sighed a little and looked out the window of the bus as they continued towards the game. Chapter 22. Over Dramatics and High Honors. America stretched, getting out of the chair he'd been sitting in since about 11 last night. He looked at the 3 finished pins. Honestly, quite content with them. They were drawings he had done on treated paper that he'd gone over with a careful coat of UV resin. One pin was an orchard oriole, a female one. It felt a little silly to give Russia something that blatantly represented himself, but he figured that it fit since the other pin was a mountain lion, something that reminded him of Russia. The last pin was the same oriole and mountain lion, the oriole flying around the mountain lion. He carefully picked them up and put them into a small package, so that he could ensure Russia received the pins undamaged. He put it into his pocket and grabbed the other gift, a yellow frog plush. He made his way to the kitchen, taking some bread and putting it in the toaster. While he waited, he grabbed a pen and started to write a note, so that his dad wouldn't tear up the town looking for him when he was just going to school early. "I thought you were right-handed," America heard the tired-sounding voice of his brother say. "Canada, I speak for both Dad and myself when I say this. Shut up. Hand is hand." Canada, being the dramatic hellion he is, held the back of his hand to his forehead while saying, "Betrayed by my own brother. 'Tis a sad day. For Alexa, play allies or enemies." "You've been spending too much time with Kiwi. Alexa, stop." Canada walked away, still pretending like he had been betrayed, acting as though he'd been stabbed. America shook his head, grabbing the toast and buttering it before leaving the note and walking out of the house to go to school. He needed to get out there early if he didn't want to get caught, as he noticed sometimes Russia rode the bus, and sometimes he was there earlier, and he personally wasn't interested in getting caught. The walk was a fairly short one, only about 20 minutes. He looked back at his phone, considering what Gliss had suggested, talking to Russia. He wasn't sure it'd go well, and he couldn't find any signs that Russia would not be hostile towards him. But Russia also hadn't really shown any real signs of dislike towards him since after their first really bad interaction. He didn't feel safe reaching out without proof that Russia was at least okay with his existence. Proof he didn't have yet. Proof he might never have. That thought bothered him. This sort of limbo he was in had never ended well. Not for him, at least. Usually, whoever seemed indifferent to him ended up hating him for one reason or another. He wasn't sure how long this state of limbo would go on for before he reached the likely ending of Russia disliking him. It wasn't unusual for him. Even if someone was close to him, they sometimes would end up hating him. He remembered being friends with Dubai. They had been close, almost best friends. Dubai hadn't minded that his hobbies seemed feminine, though he did tease him about it. Good things didn't last, something America now knew well. At some point, he'd started to have what he thought was a crush at the time. He thought even if it'd make things awkward, he would be safe to tell him about it. He had been dead wrong. He'd started to tell Dubai that he was gay, and before he knew it, his once friend had left him and called him a slur on the way out. He shook his head to clear his thoughts as he entered the school. He knew now that what he'd been feeling wasn't a crush. It was just a craving for a closer, queer platonic bond with someone he'd perceived as safe. It turned out that the person wasn't safe. And now that he thought back to it, he was glad to not be close to that person. Though sometimes he couldn't help but miss the friend he'd once had. He couldn't help but find a connection between his situation and the song How to Rest by the Crane Wives. He'd found it a little funny, since he quite literally couldn't rest. He shook his head in an attempt to clear the memories and the dramatic irony of the connection between the song and his life. Looking up to find that he was in front of the school already. He headed in and made his way over to Rush's locker, doing a quick check to make sure no one was nearby before carefully putting the wrapped pins in. He closed the locker and quickly made his way to the library, planning to pick back up where he'd left off in the book that he'd been recommended. But he paused for a second, considering that it may be a good idea to stay to see Russia's reaction, especially since he wanted to know if Russia enjoyed the gift. He sighed and looked through his phone, deciding to read a book on his phone while he waited. After a while, he could hear someone's footsteps, so he looked up to see who was coming. Seeing that it wasn't Russia, it was his once friend, Dubai. He hid himself away fairly quickly, not wanting to be spotted. Soon enough, he heard Dubai walking off. He let out a relieved sigh and mentally thanked the luck granted to him by the stars. Or, well, that's how he liked to think about it. He didn't take himself out of his little hiding spot, not seeing a reason to, as it had a fairly good view of Russia's locker. Plus, it wasn't exactly uncomfortable either. Ultimately, it had more benefits than detriments. It wasn't much longer after Dubai was gone that he saw Russia. He smiled a little as he saw Russia open his locker and retrieve the pins, admittedly getting a little excited as he saw Russia taking them out of the casing. Then Russia did something he wasn't at all expecting. Taking off his hat, that America distantly recognized as an Ushanka, and affixing the pins to it before putting it back on. He flushed a little at that. Russia almost certainly didn't know how high of an honor that kind of thing felt like. especially seeing as this was the third time he'd done it. The 2 bracelets he had made seemed to have become a permanent fixture in Russia's outfit, and he'd yet to see the scarf outside of the day he'd given it to Russia, which was something he had expected, since they were still in a fairly warm fall at the moment. Chapter 23, Rule number 12, Muscle isn't always visible. Russia smiled a bit, finding the pins his gift-giver had given him cute. Though it still frustrated him that he didn't know who they were. He shook his head to clear his thoughts as he collected the book from his locker and then closed the locker. He headed towards room number 126. He then leaned on the wall, looking over to see if he could find anyone in the hallway. Maybe he could figure out who was giving him these gifts. He spent the last few minutes before the halls flooded with people attempting to spot the person. He didn't care who it was, he just wanted to let them down gently. Their intentions seemed pretty damn clearly romantic. And they had been since the rose candles. He needed to find them so they were less hurt. He already had someone he was interested in, and the sooner he could break it to the person, the better. He may not know this artsy person, but they definitely deserved someone who was actually interested in them. And that person wasn't him. The sooner he caught them, the less it'd hurt them in the long run. He didn't want to hurt them more, so considering taking them as a friend was out of the question. That would leave the gift-giver with a lot more emotional turmoil. But he wouldn't turn down friendship if he was wrong about their intentions. He glared at the wall after the bell had rung and classes started. He had gained a new personal distaste for world history. He was happy when the dismissal bell for the first period rang, happily getting up and collecting his stuff, leaving the classroom, heading to his locker and putting his textbook down for the next class and collecting the one for the next one. Before he headed to his next class, he paused at America's locker, sticking down another sticky note. It said, "Hey, beautiful. Are you a fruit? Because I believe we'd make a great pair." He couldn't help himself. America was beautiful, and if you were honest, from everything he'd heard about the little cutie, he was also his type. So he really wasn't lying with the flirt. He then backed away to see America's reaction to it. He watched as America grabbed the note, read it, and then went red in the face. He'd be lying if he said that he didn't like that reaction. He smiled a little as he saw America stick the note to the inside cover of the binder he was carrying. He'd noticed that America was keeping all of them, and he kind of liked knowing that America kept them. He hoped they were helping give America more confidence. He shook his head and started towards the room for his next class. He hummed to himself as he took a seat and waited for roll call, allowing himself to zone out while he waited for Miss Dackerman to get to him. He happily greeted her when she got to him, acknowledging that he was here. Once she had left, he glanced towards America. He noticed that America was cleaning something off of his desk and frowned, noticing that whatever it was made the other upset. So he took out a little piece of paper, writing, "Hey, are you doing all right there, cutie?" He could swallow his pride to make America feel better. Plus, he wasn't lying about being concerned, or that he thought America was a cutie. He was cute among other things, sexy as fuck being one. Once he was marked present and had the work for class, he distracted himself with that. As soon as he was done with the work packet, he went back to looking at America. He noticed that little bit of red hair that stuck up in the side part of his hair. It seemed to have a mind of its own and move on its own accord. almost as though it went with his emotions. He smiled. Honestly, that was kind of cute. It was nice to have a way to read the cutie, as his eyes were covered. He couldn't really get that easy of a read on America. His body language seemed really controlled, and his eyes were fully covered. That photophobia was a damn shame because America had pretty eyes, and it shouldn't cause pain to see light. He shook his head a little to clear his thoughts. It wasn't long until the dismissal bell rang. He waited and watched as America got up and headed out of the classroom before he got up himself and collected the note on his desk. When he read it, he was more concerned than the cutie definitely wanted. The response read, "Someone just wrote stuff on my desk again. Again, nothing I'm not used to. Don't worry about me so much." He couldn't help but worry more about that. Telling someone to not worry kind of had the opposite effect. Especially with this sort of thing. Not that he could fault America. He sighed and headed to the lunchroom, tucking away the note into his bag. He sat down at a lunch table with Cuba, sighing a little. "I wish he would have told me how bad he was being bullied," Russia grumbled. "And who was responsible?" If I did that, I don't think there'd be anyone here, so I don't think I should," Cuba simply stated. "Then I'll get the information out of him myself, when I get to talk to him properly," Russia grumbled out the last part, well aware that he probably wouldn't have that in him for at least another week. Cuba sighed, and Russia went back to picking out his lunch. Eventually, lunch was over, and he headed to the gym building. During gym, they were going to be doing weight training. The small safety lecture was boring, but otherwise, the class went by pretty quickly. There wasn't much of note for him, though he found himself admittedly surprised by how much America seemed to be able to lift. It did not look like he had the muscles to back up what he was doing. It was impressive, but also baffling. America was lifting more than he weighed. That he was sure of. America looked like an entire twink, skinny as a stick. But he was lifting his own weight and then some. He let out a low whistle. "You done?" he heard Cuba say. He grumbled, dragging his gaze away from America. "How much is he even lifting?" "Probably 125 pounds. 57-ish kilos, if I were to guess. His weight and a half," Cuba responded, leading them over to a machine. "Damn, he's strong," Russia absent-mindedly commented. "Yeah, real athletic. He could probably do lifting competitively. Don't know why he doesn't. Guess he just likes cheer too much." Russia shrugged and got himself into position. The rest of the class flew by, and so did the next one. It wasn't long before he was in practice, and they were doing their usual thing. His thoughts kept drifting to America, whenever he had time to let them wander. He was entirely fucked. Chapter 24, Medical Exemptions and Group Projects. America leaned against the wall, pressing himself into a hiding spot as he watched Russia collect his next gift. The simple yellow frog plush. He felt excited. He always loved watching others receive gifts that he had made. It always had been that way. He got far more joy out of giving things to people than he did anything else. Only once Russia came into view and took the gift out of his locker and let out a quiet, startled noise, that he realized what he was doing could be perceived as a courting ritual for a fellow avian. He didn't mean it that way, though. He wasn't trying to be chaste. He just wanted a friend. Giving gifts was part of proving capable as a mate. He wasn't looking to be one. Not yet. He just wanted a friend. He let out an embarrassed chatter before covering his mouth, hoping Russia wouldn't find him. Luckily, Russia either didn't hear him or didn't bother to look. Either was possible, especially with the crowd that had started to form in the hall before Russia had collected the gift. He was lucky he was still able to see Russia's locker. He sighed to himself a little as he ran off towards Mr. Weatherly's class. He hated that godforsaken class. He loved to learn, but he hated that class. Hated that teacher. He couldn't blame the class, which would probably be interesting if Mr. Weatherly wasn't its teacher. He knew he only knew one side of Mr. Weatherly. But that side was enough for him to not want to know anything more of him. Some people were just like that. They only presented their bad. He knew that there was more to people like Mr. Weatherly, who only presented their bad. There was more to them. He hoped, at least. Because just bad was bound to be downright miserable. He didn't like the idea of that amount of misery. He sighed to himself and shook his head, deciding to distract himself from the misery of the class. It didn't feel as bad when the bell rang, and the class was over. He was pleasantly surprised by the lack of attention on him, though it may have had something to do with the fact that he'd noticed Russia giving Mr. Weatherly one of, if not the, most hateful looks that he had ever seen on anyone. He was personally very glad that look was not directed at him. He wouldn't have been able to take it. That he was sure of. As soon as class let out, he got his stuff together before heading to his next class. He was excited to see Miss Ackerman. He saw a note on his locker, picking up to read it. He flushed as he read it. He really needed to stop them. Needed to let them down gently. It was a weird feeling to be flirted with. The note read, "Are you a bank loan? Because you have my interest." And there was a little winky face drawn at the end of the note. He shoved the note into his binder and quickly shoved the world history book back into his locker and collected his biology book. He rushed off to the class, very much flustered by the note. He shook his head and settled himself into the seat in the back of the class, glancing and noticing that his desk had nothing written on it, nor were there any notes. A pleasant surprise. He put his book down and his binder before looking around to see who all was already there. He almost jumped out of his skin when he saw that Russia was seated beside him, glaring holes into the back of the head of one Simon Dreg. Sure, he didn't like Simon much himself, but he had to wonder what Simon had done to vex his unnaturally tall classmate. Only thing he could think of was this might be his overdramatics and flirting. He knew he wasn't the only one that Simon hit on, though the way Simon did it to him made him more self-conscious, and wished that he did not exist. It wasn't the same way that the person who left him sticky notes did. All he knew is he didn't like it. Maybe he'd done it to Russia, and that's why he seemed to want to will Simon out of existence. He shook his head to rid himself of the train of thought. It wasn't his business anyway. Soon enough, Miss Ackerman was making her rounds to collect attendance. She was quiet and polite when she got to him, as she always was, making sure his morning was going well before going to the next student. He sighed and allowed himself to get lost in thought. He couldn't really wait for chemistry class, as he was looking forward to the project that Mr. Reinhardt was giving them. He knew it was going to be fun. All of the projects that he gave them were. He was snapped out of his thoughts by the bell ringing, so he recollected his things and put them away before leaving the classroom. He made his way to the library and settled to read and have a small salad. He ended up continuing to read the book that he'd been recommended, grumbling to himself as he tried to find where he'd left off. Why he'd seen it as a good idea to get the PDF of it, he didn't remember, nor care. He was more frustrated that he'd done that. At least he knew that he was roughly halfway through chapter 15. Once he'd managed to find where he left off, he was sucked right back into the mystery. He was about halfway through the book at the moment, and he was excited to see where the story was going to go. He was a bit disappointed when lunch was drawing to an end, making sure that he took a note of where he'd gotten to before getting up and going to the locker room. He grabbed the uniform, heading into one of the stalls to change into it. He stepped out of the stall after changing quickly, then taking his normal clothes and folding them and putting them into his locker. He started towards the gym, noticing that Russia was there and getting ready to change, so he quickly averted his eyes. He was not going to be a creepy person. No, thank you. He stepped out into the hall and towards the gymnasium, stopping by the water fountain to get some water before he continued on towards it. He wasn't sure what they'd be doing in gym today. He waited by the door until he saw someone else. Russia, his mind supplied, came towards him and the door. He noticed Russia glance at him before opening the door and holding it for him. He internally freaked out for a second before dipping his head and saying a quick "thank you" and rushing through the door. It, however, turned out to be a bad time for him. Luckily, he was still allowed to sit out on football. He hated that it further set him aside as different. But he had slightly hollow bones, avian adaptations, ones that were useless to him, ones meant for flight. He sighed when it was announced, waiting to be led to the field. He'd be doing scorekeeping, like usual. What he wasn't expecting to hear was a loud, "What the fuck?" when he took his usual spot. That confused him. Usually no one commented. "Why is he off to the side?" he heard Russia ask. Coach Falk let out a grumpy-sounding sigh, crossing his arms. "You're new here, so I'll let it pass. He's got an exemption. He'll tell you more if he wants to." America felt himself relax a little as he was able to get by without having to disclose that particular information. Russia seemed to glare at Coach Falk for a second before shrugging to himself. America noticed Cuba lean over and whisper to Russia. America didn't say anything. One thing he knew about Cuba was that he was friendly. And he also knew dang near everything about everyone. He was pretty sure, though, that Cuba knew the least about him, as he was far more aware of his surroundings and people than everyone else in school. He had noticed that through his own people watching. He wouldn't be surprised if Cuba knew what his medical exemption was, since he'd seen the note on Coach Falk's desk, and he handed it over on the first day of class. Cuba had likely snuck around to find it. He shook his head and got himself back into the correct headspace. He was, admittedly, very bored for that whole period. He was glad when he was finally able to go back to the locker room and get changed. He let out a sigh once he was back into his normal clothes. He got his bag and bolted off towards the chemistry classroom, which was more like a lab. He took his usual spot and waited for class to start. The bell rang, and it was quickly followed by an excited, "Hello, and welcome back to class, little chemists," from Mr. Reinhardt. He smiled. He always loved how Mr. Reinhardt started classes. Today, we will be starting a group project, so pick your partners. Mr. Reinhardt smiled and took a seat, ready to let them just pick their partners. Brian, being the drifter he was, came up to him, assuming that America would take him as his partner. So, America, let's partner up again, yeah? Always goes well, Brian purred. America shook his head. No. I'd actually prefer not. You don't really contribute. You go talk to your friends and leave me with the work. America responded with a quiet tone. What? No, I don't, Brian shouted, ever the freeloader with excuses. You do, every time. I always end up with all the work, and then you try to take credit when we do presentations. America responded, getting up and going over to Mr. Reinhardt. Mr. Reinhardt, do you think I could work alone? I don't. Brian wants to work with me, and I don't feel comfortable doing so. So, could I work alone? America asked, feeling timid and anxious about asking. Well, I can't let you work alone, but I'll put you down as not to work with him again. Please let me know when someone makes you uncomfortable like that again, Mr. Reinhardt said in a soft tone, writing down a quick note. America nodded, a bit disappointed. He went back to his seat, thinking about who he should work with. Maybe he should work with Kelly. He considered that until he noticed her pairing with her boyfriend. He internally sighed, going back to thinking. He nearly jumped out of his skin when he heard a light tap on his desk. He looked up to see that it was Russia. Hey, Russia, America stuttered out. I would like if you work with me, Russia stated. I promise to do my share of the work. I suppose it wouldn't hurt, America muttered. Thank you. I will go tell Mr. Reinhardt. I will be back, Russia said before walking away. America sighed to himself and sunk into a seat. Maybe Russia didn't dislike him. Russia returned after a while, sitting beside him. I bring knowledge of project, Russia said, seeming quite happy with himself. We are doing research on the chemistry of corrosion. We are doing a lab on this once everyone has partner. America hummed and nodded, settling himself into a seat. After a beat of silence, America looked up at Russia, deciding to ask a question that had been bothering him for quite a while. Do you hate or dislike me? America asked, internally panicked about the potential answers. Нет, я не. Russia responded, moving and resting a hand on America's head. The Russian translates to, No, I do not. America paused for a second, trying to remember what that meant. He knew a fair share of Russian, since his dad knew it, and honestly tossed him with people who spoke so many different languages that he understood just about anything thrown at him. Wait, I was speaking Russian. I am sorry, Russia apologized. I said I do not. I don't hate you. I do not dislike you either. I know, it just took me a second. I just needed to knock the language part of my brain for a second, America assured quickly, not wanting to make Russia feel awkward. Wait, you speak Russian? Russia exclaimed, looking genuinely excited. I don't speak it well, but I can understand it. I didn't have anyone to teach me to speak it, America admitted. Still cool. You are a friend now, Russia hummed, hugging America. I will teach you to speak it. America internally panicked, his face flushing a little. Sorry, I did not mean to make you panic. Russia apologized, letting go of America. You're fine, America said softly, lightly patting Russia's back. Before Russia could respond, Mr. Reinhardt was getting the class to focus again, to tell them what they were going to be doing. Chapter 25, Rule number 13, Expect the Unexpected. Russia smiles to himself. He was glad he was able to befriend America. He was excited to go see his friend, even if it was only during school hours, for now. He knew he had a crush on America, but he doubted that America would accept his feelings yet. So, friendship was enough. As he started towards the school, he considered the mystery person leaving things in his locker. He was glad he'd probably be able to catch them today. He'd hang back after school to watch out for them. He wanted to clear that up before he even considered trying to date the cutie. America didn't deserve any extra anxiety, especially since America seemed observant enough to figure it out. He didn't want someone leaving things in his locker and screwing up his chances because the person he was interested in was an observant knowledge sponge. And America seemed a little pessimistic, since the immediate assumption was that he, Russia fucking Moscow, hated him. Russia couldn't believe that. America thought he hated him. He still wasn't over it. What the fuck did he do to give that impression? He'd ask Ukraine, but she'd tell him to figure it out yourself, genius, which would be of no help. He'd ask Cuba, but Cuba would probably just call him a dumbass and leave it at that, which would also be of no damn help. He wanted to get closer to America before he asked, and wanted to make sure America saw him as trustworthy enough to be honest about why he thought that. He shook his head as though to rid himself of the thoughts, continuing on his way to school. Soon enough, he was walking into the school. He noticed America hanging out around fairly early once, so he hoped he could talk and walk with his new friend. He looked around the cafeteria when he entered, not spotting America there, so he continued on to the hall and looked around near their classroom for their first period. He spotted America over by his locker, so quickly made his way over there, excited to see his friend. "Привет!" Russia excitedly greeted as he approached his friend. He wanted to hug him, but hesitated, unsure if America was okay with that. He waited for a second before asking, "May I hug?" America nodded, only hesitating for a second before he moved closer to Russia for the hug. Russia happily hugged his friend for a moment before letting go, so that he wouldn't make America uncomfortable. He then started towards his own locker, smiling at America. "Let me get necessary books from my locker," Russia hummed, opening his locker. He wasn't too surprised to find another gift, but it still surprised him a little when he saw it. He was a little surprised to find an embroidered coaster. The cloth was a nice maroon color, and the embroidery was a golden yellow. It was a nice, simple tree. The coaster was trimmed with a short red lace. It looked very nice. He smiled a little. It was his favorite colors. He'd keep it. It was of good quality. He might not know who made it, but he'd find out eventually. He tucked it into his bag and grabbed his world history book from his locker, which he also put in his bag. He then turned back to America, looking at him with a smile. "What do you usually do when you get here this early?" he asked, tilting his head. I usually go hang out in the library," America muttered, looking away nervously. "Well, would you like to do that?" Russia asked with a smile on his face. He was eager to get to know America better. "Sure, I mean, we could also work a bit on the project, if you wouldn't mind that." America shifted his weight a little. It looked like he was really nervous about being this close to someone. Russia recognized the feeling. He used to feel that, but now he didn't really care anymore. He hoped he'd be able to help America realize that he was worth attention, positive attention, and that other people had no right to do whatever they had been doing to cause anxiety for wanting to be around. He'd do it. America deserved it. Of course, Russia agreed with a bit of a grin. Do you have any ideas about the format of presentation? I made a few templates, if you want to see them. America stumbled over his words anxiously. It was cute, but he wished America was a little more confident. Russia hummed, following America to the library, where they sat across from each other and worked on the project. Russia drafting up a few ideas for parts of the presentation, while America looked through some research. The two of them worked together really well, and Russia quickly found that a focused America looked very fucking cute. He had this habit of sticking out his tongue, and he looked really intensely at whatever he was focused on. It was fucking adorable. He couldn't say that enough. That he was sure of. He was a bit disappointed when the two of them needed to head back to the room for first period. He hoped he wasn't imagining that America looked a bit disappointed too. A bit into class, after roll call, he heard America whisper, "Can we just go outside? The walls are tired of watching us fail." In response to their bastard of a teacher calling on him after asking about something that was not in their textbook, before stuttering out what was most likely the correct answer, if their teacher's lack of response was anything to go by. Russia had to bite his tongue to keep himself from laughing, opting to lean over and slightly ruffle America's hair. America leaned into his touch slightly, seeming to enjoy the touch. Russia internally cooed at that, finding it absolutely adorable. He ended up focused on America for the rest of the period, messing with his hair a little, and quickly learning that America had long hair. Hair which he excitedly started braiding, after asking, of course. He lost track of time, only being reminded of it by the ringing of the bell. He smiled at America and got up, heading to his locker, while America went across the hall to his own. Once he'd swapped out his books, he snuck a sticky note to America's locker before they went into Miss Dackerman's class. After she'd done roll call in her very sweet way, he opted to toss a sticky note over to America, one that just had the word "cutie" on it with a heart. He was feeling absolutely bold. He wanted to say this out loud, but damn it, it wasn't something he could see going well. He watched as America opened up the little note, and then nearly immediately flushed. He ended up zoning out for a while looking at America, daydreaming. He was only brought back out of the daydream by the bell, so he got up to go to lunch, deciding to invite America to eat lunch with him and Cuba. Cuba, thank God, decided not to act like the absolute hellish stalker man that he was. America was fairly quiet, and occasionally said a response to something that was said. America got up fairly abruptly, excusing himself about 5 minutes before lunch was over. He's totally going to the gym early. He always is the first in the locker room, Cuba commented once America was out of hearing range. None of our business, Russia responded, shutting down that conversation quickly. It wasn't too long before they were following America, though. Gym was something that would be interesting. They were doing weight training again, which he honestly was excited for a weird reason. He was excited to see America being at the ungodly level of strength that he was with the tiny build he had. He ended up having to be snapped back to reality many times by Cuba, who, by the end of the period, seemed quite done with his shit. Get over yourself and try. Ask him out, dumbass. I don't enjoy being here, hearing you, and seeing you thirst after him. Get your shit together. Cuba groaned after the two of them were getting back into their previous outfits. No, I do not feel okay doing so. I don't want to get rid of little relationship. I want to get closer, Russia responded, to which Cuba only groaned. Russia sighed as he walked towards the chemistry classroom. He was slightly anxious for the last period of the day. He was hoping that the lab they'd be doing would distract him from his ever-looming feelings for America. He honestly was a little distracted during the lab, which America thankfully didn't comment on, just gently guided him through what he'd missed. America was too sweet, too good for someone like him. That didn't mean he didn't want to try. He sighed a little, but smiled to himself as he worked through the steps of the lab. Once they were done with that, America checked the time and informed him that they should hold off on the next experiment, as they were close to the end of class. He agreed and smiled to himself, zoning out until announcements started to play. He loosely paid attention to them, noting to himself that America was collecting his stuff and getting ready to go somewhere. He wanted to follow, but decided that it was more important to actually catch who was leaving him gifts. It was also fairly likely that America was going to head to cheer practice, which he had heard from one of Cuba's partners, practiced daily. Once announcements were over, he left the classroom with America, saying a quick goodbye as they split ways. America headed off towards the gymnasium. He waited before finding himself a good hiding spot, where he would remain until he saw the gift giver. While he waited, he started playing a game on his phone. He wanted to listen to music, but he needed to be able to hear whoever came down the hall. He was sitting there until a few minutes after 6, when he heard something being put on the floor. So he looked up, finding himself very surprised to see America in front of his locker, with it open, and rooting through his own bag. He got up as quietly as he could and started towards America. He saw America turn to see him and then bolt, disappearing down the hall. He followed as quickly as he could, only catching up to America out near the fountain, where he reached out and grabbed America's shoulder. He didn't like how harshly America flinched away from him at that, curling in on himself as though to protect himself. He crouched down beside America on the ground. Chapter 26. Panic Attacks and Final Gifts. America was hyperventilating. He'd been caught. There was no way that this would end well. No way. He was screwed. He shouldn't have done this. He shouldn't have started leaving gifts. He couldn't breathe. It felt like he was swallowing sand when he took in air. He couldn't feel comfortable. He just curled in on himself, hoping he could protect himself from the likely coming pain. Only that didn't come. Instead, he heard Russia settle on the ground beside him. Then he heard Russia speak. "What are 5 things that you can see?" America couldn't bring himself to breathe properly. It still felt like he was swallowing sand and sandpaper, but he tried to answer. My hands, the dirt, my shoes, the grass, and some flowers. "All right, 4 things you can touch," Russia continued. The sleeves of my sweater, the dusty ground, the stone of the fountain, and the grass," he responded, touching each thing as he said it. Breathing felt a little easier, but his throat still felt like sandpaper. He felt like he was trying to breathe underwater. 3 things you can hear," Russia prompted again. You, the birds, and some cars, America muttered. Two things that you can smell. Gasoline and... America paused, smelling the lingering scent of coffee. He couldn't tell if it was from himself or Russia. Coffee. Now, what is one thing that you can taste? Russia asked softly. America paused, noticing the coppery taste in his mouth. He'd bitten his tongue pretty hard. Blood. I think I bit my tongue. All right, now breathe with me a bit, Russia said, gently taking his hand and putting it on his chest, and starting to take a deep, definitely exaggerated breath. America did as well, slowly feeling himself starting to relax, leaning on Russia slightly. There we go, Russia said, lightly moving to start playing with America's hair. America relaxed into the touch, calming down a bit. Well, I was worried that I was going to be rejecting someone today, but I do not think I will be, Russia said, which confused him. What do you mean? America asked, confused. You are who I am interested in, Russia purred, continuing to play with America's hair. Thought that I would be rejecting romantic advances, but you are a person I like. So it is not concern. Oh, America stuttered, starting to flush. He hadn't meant the gifts in a romantic manner, but he guessed that his original intentions had been muddied, especially after he had started falling for Russia. It wasn't my original intention. I started out wanting to give you things so that you'd hate me less, but my reasoning started changing, I guess. Russia hummed softly. Well, my feelings are fairly clear. I love you. I feel the same. I want to be in a relationship. Why did you run? Russia asked after a second. Earlier, I mean, when I saw you. I didn't want to be hurt. I don't have good experience with confessions and people learning about my hobbies, America admitted quietly. I won't hurt you, never. If I do, tell, so that I can stop, Russia quickly said, hugging America. America relaxed against Russia, feeling comfortable there. He really liked being this close to Russia. Could I kiss you? Russia asked after a long pause, averting his gaze nervously after saying it. Yes, America mumbled, looking up at Russia. He closed his eyes when he felt Russia's hands on his cheeks, and leaned in as Russia kissed him. It was a little bit awkward at first, but a little adjustment on both of their ends, and it was a lot nicer. The second kiss felt even better. America really enjoyed it, but pulled away after a second, curling up into Russia's chest. It is probably a good time to go back. You need to get your bag and then go home, Russia stated, getting up and holding America. He carried America back towards the school, going back in and heading towards his locker. He put America down and watched as he got his bag, going back to looking through it. America handed him something after a bit of searching. It was another plush. This one was a cat made of red faux fur and had 2 buttons for eyes. Russia smiled and hugged the plush before hugging America. Would you like to stay at my house tonight? America asked after a second, quite nervous. Of course, if it is okay, Russia responded excitedly. I'm sure it's It'll be alright. My little brother has more people over more frequently. I'm sure it's alright. Russia nodded, watching as America texted someone. He was then led out of the school by America and to a car. They were in the car for a while, then America headed back to his room, sure that Russia was right behind him. He settled into his room, disappointed that Russia hadn't been right behind him, but busied himself with drawing, hoping that Russia would join him soon. He heard footsteps approaching his room and looked up, in the direction that they were coming from, finding a very pale-looking Russia, who he promptly ran over to and started checking over. Russia just hugged him and nuzzled his face into America's hair. America sighed and smiled, lightly hugging Russia and relaxing. Eventually, the two of them were laying on America's bed when Russia noticed something. "What is in there?" Russia asked, gesturing to the slightly ajar drawer on America's side table. "Oh, someone has been leaving me little sticky notes. They help me feel better about myself. I want to know who's leaving them. I want to thank them, but I also want to let them down gently," America explained, looking up at Russia. Oh, that's me. I leave them to make your day better. You are beautiful, and I hear shit talk of you, and I do not want that to be perception of self," Russia quickly said. "May I kiss you?" America asked quietly. Russia nodded quickly, leaning in slightly. America didn't hesitate, kissing Russia and pulling away after a second. "Thank you. Those help more than you know," America said softly. "You are too sweet," Russia responded, hugging America close. "I stand by all of it, you know." "You're very cheesy, then," America giggled. "But you love me anyway." "I suppose you're right. I do." America giggled, a small smile on his face. Russia leaned closer, putting a hand on America's cheek, leaning in a bit before hesitating. "Yes?" Russia asked, unsure if it was okay to do so. "Sure," America agreed, leaning in a bit. The kiss was a bit slow and awkward, but the two of them enjoyed it regardless. Russia hugged America, who ended up slowly leading the two of them to get onto a small bed, where they were cuddling for a bit before America opted to speak, albeit quietly. "Why were you so far behind me?" he asked, looking up at Russia. "Because your father gave me shovel talk. Wanted to make sure that I do not hurt you," Russia mumbled, moving to bury his face in America's hair. It was silent for a while before America spoke again. The silence was comfortable, though. I love you," America said quietly. "I love you too," Russia responded happily. And that is the end of this book. I don't have anything planned after this. I don't have permission for anything. So, I probably won't be posting for a while. I've reached out to anyone who has a complete book at this point. I have nothing. So, next time you see me, it might be a one-shot I wrote or something. I don't know the next time you'll see me. Give me some requests in the comments. You can do Italia or Country Humans. As long as it's complete, I don't care. I will read it. Given I can get permission from the author. I still don't know how to feel about the time that several of you, not just one of you, not just two of you, 5 of you, have asked me to read a book from someone who is dead. They cannot give me permission. That's like part of my process. I ask and reach out for permission to read a book. Please understand that. I have no one I can reach out for permission to for those 5 of you. You know who you are. I know you know who you are. I'm just gonna leave it as is, okay? But I guess that being said, I hope you enjoyed the book. I really loved writing this one. And I've been told that I can write very relatable characters. And I'm very thankful that you guys think that. Also, I'm very proud of my depiction of a panic attack. I wrote it because I've had one. I wrote it like how I've had them, okay? So if those of you who are gonna bitch at me, I will throw hands. I say this like I wouldn't immediately curl up in a ball of anxiety if one of you just said it. I'd just be like, oh my god, I'm so fucking sorry. But no, the depictions of anxiety in the chapters where I've actually got it written, that's how I've experienced anxiety. So please don't call it inaccurate, because that makes me feel like shit. Anyway, have a nice rest of your day, night, or whatever it is for you. And I don't know the next time I will see you on this channel. Leave suggestions, please. Have a nice rest of your day, night, or whatever it is for you. Bye!